Sir, everyone deserves respect no matter what job they do. She said it soft, but every man in that diner heard it. Jackson Whitmore laughed. He didn't know that 4 words would end the life he thought he was owed. He didn't know that in the corner booth 14 men in worn leather had already stopped chewing. He didn't know that the tired woman refilling his coffee had buried her only daughter and was raising a little boy on tips and aching feet. He was about to learn all of it the hard way. Before we go on, if you believe a person's worth isn't measured by the size of their bank account, subscribe to this channel and stay with me to the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels. The bell over the door of the Silver Spoon Diner jangled hard enough to rattle the little glass sugar jars on every table. And that was the first thing anybody noticed about Jackson Whitmore, that he never once in his whole 20 years of life had learned how to walk into a room quietly. He came in way rich boys come in when they have been up all night and haven't yet been told no. Loud, careless, certain the world had been arranged for his convenience. Behind him trailed 3 others cut from the same expensive cloth, still smelling of last night's cologne and this morning's regret, laughing at a joke that had already stopped being funny 2 counties ago. This place still exists, Jackson said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. I thought Montana was a rumor. One of his friends snorted. The old man at the counter didn't look up from his eggs. It was a little past 9 in the morning, and the Silver Spoon had that steady, unglamorous rhythm that little roadside places have when they've been feeding truckers and ranch hands and grandmothers for 40 years. There was nothing there for a boy like Jackson. That more than anything was why he'd wanted to stop. His friends had said, let's keep driving. There's a real place an hour up the road, and Jackson had said no. He'd pointed at the cracked neon and the gravel lot and said, let's slum it. It'll be funny. That was the kind of boy he was. He didn't stop to eat. He stopped to have something to look down on. The woman who came to seat them was 58 years old, though the tiredness in her face made strangers guess older and the kindness in it made them a minute later guess younger. Her name was Clara Hayes. Her hair had been gold once and now was gold going gray, pinned back the way a woman pins it when she's given up on it being anything but out of the way. She wore the same apron she'd worn for 2 decades, faded at the pocket where her order pad rubbed, and she moved with the particular careful grace of someone whose knees have been telling her the truth for years. Good morning, Clara said, and she meant it. Just the 4 of you booth by the window's got the best light this time of day. We'll sit wherever we want, Jackson said, and walked past her without waiting. Clara didn't flinch. She'd been walked past by better men than Jackson Whitmore, and worse ones, too. She grabbed 4 menus, tucked her pen behind her ear, and followed the boys to the booth they'd chosen, the big one in the middle, the one that seated 6 taken by 4 who'd tip like 2. Coffee to start, she asked. Is it fresh? Jackson said. He didn't look at her. He looked at his phone. Made a fresh pot 10 minutes ago. Then make another one. I don't want the one that's been sitting. His friends laughed. Clara smiled, the real worn, patient smile of a woman who long ago decided that other people's rudeness was a weather she could stand in without getting wet. I'll bring you the best cup in the county, she said, and went to get it and did not once let them see that her jaw had tightened. Now in the far corner of that diner, past the pie case and the little jukebox nobody had fed a quarter to since spring, there was a long table pushed together out of 2 smaller ones, and around it sat 14 men. They wore leather. Not the soft dyed leather rich men buy to feel dangerous old leather cracked at the elbows, patched and repatched leather that had ridden through 40 years of weather and dust and grief. On the backs of their vests, if you'd had the nerve to look, you'd have read 2 words that made most folks in that part of the country lower their voices. Hell's Angels. They came to the Silver Spoon every couple of weeks, this crew on their way east or their way home, and Clara knew most of them by name and all of them by their orders. They were to her simply regulars. Quiet men who ate a lot of eggs, drank a lot of coffee, left folded bills under the salt shaker without making a show of it, and always called her ma'am. At the head of that table sat a man named Logan Carter. He was 52 years old. His hair, like Clara's, had once been gold and was now the color of old rope tied back off a face that had been broken and healed and broken again in a life he did not talk about much. He had the eyes of a man who had seen the worst thing a person can do to another person and had decided somewhere along the road that he was not going to be that thing. Logan noticed Jackson the way an old dog notices a snake in the yard, not with fear, with a slow, calm attention. He watched Clara bring the second pot of coffee. He watched her set the cup down in front of the boy, with both hands gentle the way she set everything down. He watched Jackson pick it up, take one sip, and make a face like she'd handed him something scraped off the road. "This is worse than the first one," Jackson announced. "I can make you. I don't want you to make me anything. I want you to bring me coffee that a human being can drink." The diner had gone a little quieter. Not silent, just attentive. The old man at the counter set his fork down. A trucker in the next booth over stopped mid-bite. Everyone in a place like that develops an ear for the particular tone a morning takes on when a stranger decides to be cruel, and that tone had just entered the room. Clara took the cup. "I'm sorry it's not to your liking," she said. "Let me try again." She went. And this is the part the story needs you to understand because it's the part that decides everything that comes after. Clara Hayes was not weak. People who watch a scene like that and see a woman take an insult and walk away calm, they think they're watching weakness. They're not. They're watching a strength most of us will never have to find because we've never had a reason. Clara had a reason. His name was Tommy, and he was 7 years old, and he was asleep right now in a little house 11 miles up the road. And the reason Clara Hayes could stand there and let a rich boy insult her coffee without throwing the pot at his head was that Tommy needed shoes and Tommy needed dinner, and Tommy needed his grandmother to keep this job. Her daughter Tommy's mother had died 3 years back. A car, an icy road, a phone call at 2 in the morning that Clara still heard sometimes when the house was quiet. And after the funeral, when the state came asking who would take the boy, Clara Hayes, 55 years old with the bad knees and a checking account you could count on 2 hands, had raised her tired hand and said, "Me, he goes with me." So she carried the second rejected cup of coffee back to the kitchen and dumped it out and stood for one breath with both hands on the counter, and then she squared her shoulders and went back out because Tommy needed shoes. At the corner table, Logan Carter had not said a word, but one of the younger men beside him, a broad-shouldered kid named Dax 26, still learning the difference between anger and action, leaned in and muttered, "You seeing this? I'm seeing it," Logan said. I'm gonna eat my breakfast," Logan said, "and I'm gonna watch. A man tells you who he is if you let him talk long enough." Jackson was talking. Oh, he was talking. He'd found in the tired waitress a target that didn't fight back, and there is no drug in the world stronger for a certain kind of empty young man than the feeling of power over someone who won't hit back. His friends were laughing now, not because he was funny, but because it was easier to laugh than to be the next one that he turned on. That's the thing about a bully's audience. Half of them are afraid to be the audience. "Hey," Jackson called across the room, snapping his fingers. Snap, snap, like calling a dog. "Hey, coffee lady." Clara turned. "My eggs are cold." "You haven't gotten your eggs yet, sir. I just put the order." "Then why is it taking so long? What is the chicken out back laying them one at a time?" His friends roared. Jackson grinned, delighted with himself. Clara walked over. She stood at the end of their booth with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she said, calm as still water, "I'll go check on your order right now. It shouldn't be much longer. Can I bring you anything while you wait?" "Some water juice." "I want you to bring me a manager who knows how to run a restaurant." "I am the manager this morning, sir. It's just me and Ray in the kitchen till the lunch girl comes at 11. Jackson leaned back and looked at her. Really looked at her, up and down the apron and the gray hair and the sensible shoes, and something crossed his face that was uglier than boredom. It was contempt, the pure kind, the kind that isn't even angry, that just decides another human being doesn't count. "That explains it," he said. "This whole place is a joke. You're a joke." The room went 1 degree colder. And here is where the old man at the counter, his name was Earl, 79, retired rancher, ate the same breakfast every day of his life, spoke up for the first time. "Son," Earl said, not turning around, "why don't you eat your breakfast and let the lady work?" Jackson's head snapped toward him. "Was I talking to you, Grandpa?" "You're talking to the whole room way you're carrying on." "Then plug your ears." Earl went back to his eggs. He was 79 and he'd buried a wife and a son, and he'd learned that some fights aren't yours to start. But his hand, the story wants you to know, had tightened around his coffee mug. Even the mild men in that room were starting to feel the thing that had woken up in the corner booth. Because in the corner booth, Logan Carter had put down his fork. Not fast, not dramatic. He just stopped eating. And the 13 men around him who had been talking low among themselves the whole time went quiet one by one, the way a field goes quiet when the wind stops, because they had ridden 10,000 miles with this man, and they knew the meaning of Logan Carter putting down his fork. Nobody at that corner table moved, but the whole crew had turned just slightly toward the middle of the room. Clara felt it. Everybody felt it. Everybody except Jackson, who was too busy being 20 years old and untouchable to notice that the temperature of the room had changed under his feet. His eggs came. Ray brought them out himself, a big, quiet man with a burned scar up one forearm, and set the plate down harder than he needed to. "There's your eggs," Ray said, and it wasn't friendly. Jackson looked at the plate. He picked up his fork. He poked the eggs like they might be poisoned. And then he did a thing that made even his own friends go quiet for the first time. He picked up the plate, and he tipped it slow, deliberate, looking Clara right in the eye the whole time, and he let the eggs slide off onto the table. "Oops," he said. The eggs sat there in a yellow heap on the formica. "Clean it up," Jackson said. Nobody laughed now, not even his friends. There's a line, and even boys who came up spoiled feel it when it's crossed, a little cold drop in the stomach, that says this isn't a joke anymore. This is just cruelty. One of them, the one in the back, said quietly, "Jack, man, come on." "Clean it up," Jackson said again louder to Clara. "That's your job, isn't it, cleaning up after people so clean?" And Clara Hayes, 58 years old, mother of a dead daughter, grandmother of a sleeping boy who needed shoes, took the rag from her apron, and she leaned over that table, and she began to wipe up the eggs. You could have heard a pin drop. Logan Carter watched her do it. He watched the way she wouldn't let her chin drop, the way she blinked fast twice, and did not let the tears come, the way her hand shook just slightly on the rag and then steadied, because she made it steady. He'd seen a lot of brave things in his life. Men in ditches, men who didn't come home. He would tell you later that he'd rarely seen anything braver than a tired woman wiping a rich boy's eggs off a table without letting him see her cry. "You missed a spot," Jackson said. Dax started to rise. Logan's hand came down flat on the table, not a slap, just a press palm down, and Dax sat back down. "Not yet," the hand said. "Let him finish telling us who he is." Clara straightened up. She folded the dirty rag over her hand. "Can I get you anything else?" she said, and her voice was steady. God bless her, it was steady. "Or is that all?" And Jackson Whitmore looked at this woman who had absorbed everything he'd thrown at her all morning, who had refused to break, who had refused to give him the crying and the shouting. He was really after, and something in him, something small and rotten, could not stand it. He needed her to break. Bullies always do. The refusal to break is the one thing they can't forgive. "You know what your problem is?" he said, standing up out of the booth so he was over her, using his height, using his 20 years, and his gym membership against a 58-year-old woman's bad knees. "Your problem is you think you're better than this. You're not. You're a waitress in a nowhere diner in a nowhere town, and you'll die a waitress in a nowhere diner, and you should be grateful. Grateful that somebody like me even sat down in your garbage restaurant." "Sir," Clara started. "People like you," Jackson said, "should be on your knees thanking people like me." And Clara Hayes looked him in the eye. She was scared she'd tell you later she was scared, her heart going like a rabbit's. But she looked him dead in the eye, and she said the four words that had started everything. "Sir, everyone deserves respect, no matter what job they do." For a second, nobody breathed. It was such a small thing to say. It was said so quietly. But it landed in that room like a struck bell, because it was true, and everybody there knew it was true. And the only person who couldn't stand for it to be true was the boy standing over her. Because, and this is the thing Jackson himself couldn't have told you, being too young and too empty to know his own heart, it was the first time in his entire life that someone with nothing had refused to be afraid of him. His whole world ran on fear and money. Money bought the fear, and the fear felt like love. And he had never once, not one single time, stood in front of a person who had neither reason to fear him nor any interest in his money. And here she was, a waitress, 58, bad knees, dead daughter, grandson who needed shoes, and she was not afraid of him. It made him insane. "What did you say to me?" he said very soft. "I said everyone deserves—" No, see, I heard you." He stepped closer. His friends had gone dead silent, now all three of them, and one had his hand halfway out like he wanted to stop what was coming and didn't have the nerve. You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't get to lecture me. You know who my father is?" "No, sir," Clara said, "but I don't imagine your father raised you to talk to a woman my age this way." That did it. That was the thing that broke the last thread in him, the mention of his father, the quiet suggestion that somewhere out there was a standard he was failing to meet. His face went white and then red. His hands came up into fists at his sides. And in the corner of that diner, Logan Carter shifted his weight forward, just an inch, just enough that his boots were flat on the floor and his knees were loose. 13 men felt him do it and settled their own weight the same way, quiet, unhurried, like a single animal getting ready to move. But Jackson didn't do the thing they were braced for. He didn't swing at her. If he'd swung, it would almost have been better. It would have been hot human, a thing a boy does when he loses his temper. What Jackson did was colder than that. He reached down slow and he picked up the cloth napkin off the table, the one that had been under his silverware, and he balled it up in his fist. And Clara, not understanding yet, said, "Sir, if you had just..." And Jackson Whitmore drew back his hand and threw the napkin in her face. It bounced off her cheek and fell to the floor. "There," he said. "Now pick that up, too." The gas that went through the diner was small, but it was real. Earl at the counter stood up off his stool. The trucker in the next booth said, "Hey," one of Jackson's own friends grabbed his sleeve and hissed his name. "Jackson, that's enough. Man, that is enough," and shook it off him. Clara did not pick up the napkin. She stood there with her hand pressed to the cheek where the napkin had struck her, and for the first time all morning the tears came. Not sobbing, just two of them spilling over to running down a face that had done nothing all morning but be kind. And she said in a voice that finally shook, "I have worked in this diner for 20 years. I have never once been unkind to a customer. Not once. I don't know what happened to you in your life that made you like this, but I am sorry it did." And that the pity, the mercy, the terrible dignity of being pitied by a woman he had spent an hour trying to humiliate was the thing Jackson Whitmore could not survive. He lost it. "Don't you feel sorry for me?" he screamed, and there was something almost like fear in it now. Some animal terror at being seen so clearly by someone he'd tried so hard to make small. "Don't you dare feel sorry for me, you, nothing, you, nobody." He stepped into her, right into her space, close enough that she could smell last night's liquor still coming off him, close enough that she stepped back and hit the edge of the empty booth behind her and had nowhere to go. And Jackson Whitmore looked into the wet, frightened, kind eyes of a 58-year-old grandmother who had done nothing to him but refused to be afraid, and he gathered himself and he spat in her face. The whole world stopped. It's a strange thing what that does to a room. A punch people understand. A punch is violence, and violence has a shape you can respond to. But to spit in a woman's face, a working woman, an old woman, a woman standing there with her hands full of somebody else's mess, that's not violence exactly. It's something worse. It's the announcement that you don't believe the other person is a person at all. Every soul in that diner felt it land like it had landed on them. Clara didn't move. She couldn't. She just stood there with the boy's spit running down her cheek, mixing with her tears and her hands frozen at her sides, and her whole 20 years of patience and dignity and kindness suddenly meaning nothing at all in the face of a boy who had decided she was garbage. For 1 second, the Silver Spoon Diner was completely, utterly silent, and then from the corner there came a sound. It was the sound of a coffee cup being set down on a saucer. Just that. One small, clear, deliberate sound, Logan Carter setting down his cup, gentle as anything in a room gone so quiet you could hear it across 40 feet of linoleum. Clink, and then a chair scraped back, and then another, and then all at once in one motion like something long asleep coming. Awake, 14 chairs scraped back from the corner table, and 14 men in old worn leather stood up. They didn't shout. That was the thing that would stay with everyone who was there that morning. They didn't shout, they didn't rush, they didn't make a single threatening move. They just stood, 14 of them. And the standing was louder than any shout could ever have been, because it filled the whole room, because every man there rose at the exact same moment, because the sound of it, the scrape and the creak of leather, and the settling of 14 pairs of boots onto the floor, said without a single word that something had just changed in the world and could not be changed back. Jackson turned around. He'd forgotten they were there. He'd been so lost in his own cruelty that he'd genuinely forgotten the 14 men in the corner, and now he turned, wiping his own spit off his lip, where a little of it had caught, and he saw them, standing, every one of them looking at him. And at the front of them, stepping out slow from behind the long table, came a broad man with rope-colored hair and the calmest, coldest, most patient eyes Jackson Whitmore had ever seen in his short and coddled life. Eyes that did not care one single dollar about who his father was. Logan Carter took one step toward the boy, and in a voice that was not loud, that was not angry, that was so quiet the whole room had to lean in to catch it, he said, 7 words that Jackson would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. "Do you know what you just did?" Jackson's mouth opened. Nothing came out, because somewhere in the deep, spoiled, frightened middle of him, a thing was waking up that had never once been awake before. Not guilt yet. He wasn't ready for guilt yet. That would take weeks. What was waking up in Jackson Whitmore for the very first time in 20 years of a life where money had built a wall around him thick enough to keep out every consequence was the oldest feeling in the world. It was the feeling of being about to answer for something. Behind him, Clara wiped her face with the back of her wrist. One of the bikers, a big older man with a white beard, had already moved quiet as anything to stand beside her, not touching her, just there, a wall between the old woman and the boy. Another had picked up the fallen napkin off the floor. 2 more had drifted, without seeming to hurry toward the door, so that Jackson's 3 friends who'd been edging toward it found the way somehow no longer open to them. Nobody had raised a hand. Nobody had raised a voice. And yet the entire diner now understood with perfect clarity that the 4 boys who'd walked in laughing were not going to walk out the same way. "I asked you a question," Logan said, still soft, still calm. "Do you know what you just did to that woman?" And Jackson Whitmore, for the first time in his life, opened his mouth to say the only words he'd ever needed before. "Do you know who my father is?" And found that in this room in front of this man, with that old woman's tears still wet on the boy's own guilty face, those words had stopped working. He said them anyway. It was all he had. Do you know who my father is?" Logan Carter looked at him for a long, long moment. Then he took another slow step closer until he was near enough that Jackson could see the lines in his weathered face, the gray in his stubble, the total absence of fear or anger or anything at all, except a terrible level certainty. And Logan said so quietly that only Jackson could hear it, "I don't care who your father is, son. I care who you are. And I just found out." Jackson Whitmore had been told no exactly 3 times in his 20 years of life, and he remembered all 3 with a bitterness that most people reserve for genuine tragedy. The first time was a kindergarten teacher who wouldn't let him cut the lunch line. His father had called the school before dinner. The second time was a girl in high school who wouldn't go to prom with him. His father had made a donation to the athletic fund the following week, and somehow, inexplicably, the girl's boyfriend had lost his starting position on the basketball team. The third time was a parking attendant in San Francisco who told him the lot was full. Jackson had left the car in a red zone and paid the ticket without looking at the amount. He had never in 20 years been told no by a man standing this close to him. Logan Carter hadn't moved. He stood at arm's length from Jackson, and he wasn't touching him, wasn't threatening him, wasn't doing anything that a camera could catch and call violence. He was simply standing there breathing, taking up space in a way that Jackson couldn't bulldoze through or buy his way past, looking at the boy with those level gray eyes that said plain as a printed page that Jackson Whitmore's name and Jackson and Whitmore's money and Jackson Whitmore's father meant absolutely nothing to him. "I don't care who your father is, son. I care who you are. And I just found out." The words sat in the air between them. Jackson's mouth moved without sound. His 3 friends behind him were absolutely still. Not the stillness of loyalty, but the stillness of people who have realized they are standing next to something they don't want to be near when it finally lands. The friend in the back, the one who'd grabbed Jackson's sleeve, the one whose name was Derek, and who would in 2 years become a pediatric nurse in Portland and spend the rest of his life quietly ashamed of this morning. Derek cleared his throat and said, "Jack, let's just go, okay? Let's just go." Jackson didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Logan because dropping his eyes felt like losing something. "Back off," he said, and his voice came out smaller than he meant it to. "I haven't touched you," Logan said. "I'm just standing here. I know who you are. You're Hell's Angels. You're a criminal." The word came out uncertain, like a bluff from a boy who's never had to bluff before. because he's always had the cards. I'll have you arrested. One phone call to your father, Logan said, not mocking, just finishing the sentence for him, the way you finish a sentence for a child who keeps starting one they can't quite complete. You've been saying that a lot this morning. Your father. His name, his money, his phone number. You've said it more than you've said your own name. He tilted his head just slightly. Does that ever bother you? Jackson blinked. It was such an unexpected thing to say. Not threatening, not aggressive, just a question, a real one. And somewhere in the middle of Jackson's chest, something shifted, some small tectonic thing that he immediately furiously pressed back down. That is none of your business, Jackson said. No, Logan agreed. It's not. But that woman's face is. The room breathed. In one motion, Jackson and Logan and every soul in the Silver Spoon Diner turned just slightly toward Clara Hayes, who was standing very still at the edge of the booth, with Ray, the cook's hand on her shoulder. Ray had come out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, and positioned himself beside Clara without a word, the way men do when they've run out of patience for being polite, and her cheek was red where the napkin had struck, and her eyes were dry now, but only because she'd made them dry. And she was looking not at Jackson, but at some fixed point past him, the way people look when they're holding themselves together by looking at something solid and far away. I think, Logan said still to Jackson, still quiet, that you owe her something. I don't owe her anything. You don't think so? She's a waitress. The word came out of Jackson the way it always had, easy, natural, requiring no thought, and the second it hit the air, he felt the room react. Not with noise. That was what he couldn't understand. The room kept not reacting the way rooms were supposed to react when Jackson Whitmore said things. In the rooms he was used to, when he said something like that, people either agreed or got quiet in a way that meant they didn't dare disagree. But this room went quiet in a different way. It went quiet the way a street goes quiet right before it rains, heavy, expectant, full of something about to happen. The big man with the white beard, the one who'd moved to stand beside Clara, turned and looked at Jackson slowly. His name was Boone. He was 61 years old. He had a daughter who worked as a teacher, a son who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan, and a wife who made the best venison stew in 3 states. He said nothing. He just looked at the boy with the flat, evaluating look of a man deciding whether something is worth his time. And he slowly shook his head once, the way you shake your head at something that has managed to disappoint you even below the very low bar you set for it. She's been working here 20 years, Logan said. She raised a daughter in this county. She's raising a grandson now, 7 years old. His mother died 3 years back. He paused. You didn't know that. I don't need to know. No, you don't think you do. That's the problem. Logan's voice never rose. Never once. That was the most unsettling thing about him, the complete absence of heat. He was not angry. He was something quieter and more durable than anger. He was decided. You walked in here this morning and you looked at her and you saw what she was wearing and where she worked, and you made up your mind about everything she was worth in about 3 seconds. And then you spent an hour proving to yourself that you were right. He looked at Jackson steadily. How often do you do that? This is insane. You don't know me. I know what I saw. Then you saw me being a paying customer who cuckoo. I saw a boy, Logan said, and he let the word sit there. Boy, not man, boy, the one word that cut right through the cologne and the car keys and the designer jeans. Spit in the face of a woman old enough to be his grandmother in a diner full of people in broad daylight because she wouldn't let him make her cry. He tilted his head. Did I miss anything? Jackson's face was doing something complicated. His jaw was working. His friends were perfectly still. Derek in the back had his eyes on the floor. I want to leave, Jackson said. Then leave, Logan said. And he stepped aside, clean as anything just moved out of the boy's path. No drama, just stepped aside. Jackson blinked. He hadn't expected that. He'd been braced for a grab, a shove, something he could define as assault and call the police about. Instead, there was just an open path to the door, and somehow the open path was worse than a hand on his chest would have been, because walking through it meant walking past Clara, and walking past Clara meant being close enough to see her face, and he could not right now, with all these eyes on him. Look at that face. He didn't move. I thought you wanted to leave, Logan said. I, Jackson's mouth closed, opened again. She started it, he said. And even as the words came out, he heard how they sounded, heard them the way you sometimes hear your own voice from outside yourself, and can't believe it belongs to you. And the flush that moved up his neck was not anger. It was something that rhymed with shame, but that he had no practice naming. She said everyone deserves respect, Logan said. That's what started it. That's what she said that made you lose your mind. He looked at the boy for a long moment. Think about that. Just take a second and think about what that tells you about yourself. From behind the counter, Earl spoke up, not turning around, still sitting on his stool with his hands around his coffee mug. I'll tell you what it tells you, the old man said. It tells you that you got scared. Boy, your age, all that money, and a 58-year-old waitress scared you right down to your boots because she wouldn't bow down to you. He finally turned on his stool just enough to look at Jackson over his shoulder. I'm 79 years old, and I've met men like you my whole life. You don't get better. Not unless something stops you. And by the looks of it, he nodded toward Logan, something just did. Nobody asked you, Jackson said. Son, Earl said mild as milk. In this diner, when you act like that in front of everybody, you made it everybody's business. The trucker in the neighboring booth stood up. He was a large man, late 40s, with a coffee-stained shirt and the quiet dignity of a man who's been up since 3 in the morning, moving things from one side of the country to the other so that people like Jackson Whitmore can have their groceries on time. He put $3 on his table for his coffee, nodded at Clara, just a nod, nothing more, and said to the room in general, I'll be outside if anybody needs a witness. He picked up his cap and he walked out, and when the little bell above the door jangled, it felt like punctuation. One of the women who had been eating quietly in the far booth, a teacher named Miriam, who would later give a statement to the county sheriff and whose account would prove to be the most detailed and precise of anyone's in the room, closed her menu, folded her napkin on the table, and said to nobody in particular, I've been coming to this diner since 1987. Clara Hayes has never been anything but kind to me. She looked at Jackson, just looked at him the way a school teachers look at a student who has done the one thing that cannot be undone. She didn't say anything else. Jackson was starting to understand in some slow and terrible way that the room had moved, that the geometry of the morning had shifted without his permission, and the audience he'd been performing for had somehow at some point become a jury. You want me to apologize, he said to Logan. That's what this is. You want me to apologize to her. I want you to understand what you did, Logan said. The apology can come after. And if I don't, Logan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was more to himself than to the room, but in the silence it carried everywhere. I've known a lot of men who hurt people and never had to answer for it, he said. Some of them figured it out eventually. Some of them didn't. The ones who didn't, they ended up very alone. And they always died surprised by it. Jackson laughed. It was a thin laugh, the laugh of a person using laughter as armor. Is that a threat? It's an observation, Logan said, from somebody who's been watching a long time. He turned and looked at Clara then, and when he did, his voice changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but more personal, like he'd stopped speaking to the room and started speaking only to her. Clara, how are you doing? Clara looked up. Something moved through her, face relief maybe, or the feeling of having held something very heavy for a very long time and having someone finally put a hand on it beside her. I'm all right, Logan, she said. Thank you. You don't have to stay out here if you don't want to. It's my diner, she said quietly. And the simplicity of it, it's my diner, the utterly unbothered ownership of a woman saying, this is where I work, this is where I belong. You don't get to make me leave was so clear and so dignified that Ray the cook standing beside her had to look at the wall for a second. It's my diner, Clara said again, and I've got tables to see to. She picked up her order pad, she tucked the pen behind her ear, and she walked away from the whole scene, from Logan, from Jackson, from all of it, and went to check on Earl's coffee refill like the morning was an ordinary one. Jackson watched her walk away. Something in him cracked just slightly. Something he wouldn't have a name for until months later, sitting in a therapist's office in Sacramento, trying to work backward through his own life for the first time. He didn't know what it was yet. He only knew it felt like the ground had gone slightly soft under his feet. His friend Marcus, the quietest of the three, the one who'd been on his phone when they walked in and had put it away the moment the eggs hit the table, spoke up for the first time all morning. "Jackson," Marcus said, and his voice was low and flat and serious. "I think we should go. Right now. I think we should apologize and pay for the food and go." "I'm not." "I'm serious," Marcus said. And he looked at his friend with eyes that said, for the first time, that he was aware of being in a room with 14 men and that being Jackson Whitmore's friend was not the same as being bulletproof. "This is not the situation. Just to apologize. Say it. 2 words, and let's go." "I don't apologize to..." "To who?" Marcus asked. The question was quiet, but it had an edge on it. "To who? Say it, Jackson. I want to hear you say the end of that sentence." Jackson didn't say it. "That's what I thought," Marcus said. And then from outside the diner came the sound that changed everything. It was a car engine. Expensive low, the particular purr of German engineering that Jackson knew because he knew every sound his Porsche made the way musicians know their instruments. It was his own car starting up in the parking lot. All 4 boys heard it. Logan heard it. The whole room heard it, and there was a half-second of confused silence before Jackson said, "What the..." and moved toward the door. Logan said quietly, "Benny." From the doorway, one of the younger Hells Angels, a kid of maybe 24 with a quick face and quick hands, said, "Already done, Logan. I got the plates." Jackson stopped. "Got the plates. What does that mean, he got the plates?" "It means," Logan said, "that your license plate number is now in the hands of every chapter within 200 miles and about a dozen other people who might want to know where your car is going." He paused. "Your car isn't going anywhere it shouldn't. Nobody touched it. I just wanted you to know that information flows both ways." Jackson turned around slowly. The flush that had been shame a moment ago was anger again now. And the anger was easier. The anger was familiar ground. "You can't do that. That's harassment. It's a parking lot," Logan said. "Public parking lot." "My father will." "Your father," Logan said. And this time the patience in his voice had a harder edge underneath it, like a floor you thought was wood. And that turns out to be stone 2 inches down. "Is not here. You've been hiding behind that man's name since you walked through the door this morning. Since before that. Your whole life from the sound of it." He looked at Jackson steadily. "I'd like to ask you something, and I'd like you to actually think about it before you answer. Have you ever in your life dealt with a consequence? Any consequence? Anything at all? Has anything you've done ever come back to you in any way?" The question landed in the room. Jackson stood there. His friends looked at the floor. "No," Logan said, answering himself. "I can see that you haven't, and I want you to understand something because I think it's something nobody has told you or they've tried and you haven't listened." He stepped 1 step closer, close enough now that he was speaking just to the boy, just to Jackson, the room falling away. Everybody at some point gets a reckoning. Men with money, men with power, men with fathers who fix everything, it doesn't matter. The reckoning comes, it always comes. The only thing money changes is how long you have to wait for it and how hard it hits when it arrives. He held the boy's gaze. "I'm standing in this diner this morning because your reckoning just arrived early, and you should be grateful for that, even if you can't see it yet." There was a silence that felt like the room exhaling. Jackson said very quietly, "Who do you think you are?" "I'm nobody," Logan said. "That's exactly the point." It was Boone, the big man with the white beard, who broke it. He'd left Clara's side and crossed the room, and now he was standing behind Jackson, not close, just there, and he said in a voice like low thunder, "The lady dropped something." And he reached past Jackson and set the fallen napkin, the one Jackson had thrown, the one that had struck Clara's face, the one that had been lying on the floor for the past 15 minutes down on the table, set it down flat, like a period at the end of a sentence. Jackson looked at it. "I think," Boone said, "you owe it to her to pick that up." The room waited. Every person in it knew that this was a small thing in the physical world and an enormous thing in every other way. A napkin off a floor. That was all. But they all knew. Earl knew Miriam. The teacher knew the cook. Ray knew the young biker Benny in the doorway. Knew all 14 men around the pushed-together corner table. Knew that whoever Jackson Whitmore was underneath the car and the clothes and his father's name was about to show himself in the simple act of bending down or refusing to. Derek in the back said softly, "Jackson, pick it up." Marcus said nothing, but he watched. And Jackson Whitmore stood there in the middle of a diner in Montana on an ordinary Tuesday morning and felt for the first time in his 20 years the weight of a room's judgment bearing down on him without his father's money underneath to hold it off. He did not pick up the napkin. He turned and walked to the door instead, and his friends, after one agonized second, followed him, and the little bell jangled, and they were gone. The room stayed quiet for another 3 seconds. Then Earl went back to his eggs. Ray went back to the kitchen. Miriam picked up her coffee cup. The normal sounds of a diner in the morning started up again slowly like music starting after a long rest. Logan stood at the window and watched the Porsche pull out of the gravel lot. The plates were already logged. 3 phones had gotten photographs. 2 of the regulars who'd witnessed the whole thing had already opened their contacts. Because this was the thing about small towns, in the particular community of men who'd spent their lives on the road between them, information moved. And Logan Carter, who was not a man who sought out trouble, was also not a man who let a thing like this quietly dissolve. He'd meant every word he'd said to Jackson Whitmore about reckonings. He'd meant the part about coming early being a mercy. He'd meant the part about men who never faced their consequences, dying alone and surprised. He also made phone calls. He went back to the corner table, sat down, picked up his coffee, still warm. He'd be grateful for that later. A small mercy in the middle of a complicated morning, and he said to the table at large, "Benny, what do we know?" "Plates are California," Benny said, settling into his chair. "The car's registered to a Richard Whitmore property group. I looked it up while it was happening. They're big, like real big, commercial real estate mostly. The kid's his only son. His name's come up before." "Come up how?" Benny glanced toward where Clara was now across the diner, refilling a man's orange juice, moving between the tables with that careful, inexhaustible grace of hers. He lowered his voice. "There was a thing in Billings last year, a hotel bar, a female bartender. The kid's father paid it off quiet from what I heard, and something in California before that. The guy's got a reputation and a father with enough money to make the reputations disappear." Logan drank his coffee. Boone said, "So this isn't the first time?" "Doesn't sound like it." Logan set the cup down. "Clara," he said, not loud, just her name, and she heard it across the room the way she heard everything in her diner, and she looked over. He raised his hand slightly, not a wave, not a gesture, just a hand, lifting a little off the table, just acknowledgement, just, "I see you, just, you're not alone in this room." And Clara nodded just once and went back to her orange juice. "All right," Logan said. He looked at the table at his crew at the remains of a breakfast that had turned into something considerably larger than breakfast. "Let's find out who else this boy has managed to hurt." The call started 10 minutes later. Quietly, methodically, without drama or theater. Just a man with a phone making careful calls to careful people the way he'd learned to do when he was young enough to be dramatic about it and had eventually grown past the drama into the efficiency. By the time Logan's second cup of coffee was half gone, he had 3 more names. A female hotel employee in Billings, a valet attendant in San Francisco, a young woman at a restaurant in Napa who'd had a meal thrown at her and whose manager had, under pressure from what sources described as a very significant tip, neglected to file any official complaint. 3 people whose names had been buried under Richard Whitmore's money for months or years. Clara came and refilled Logan's cup without being asked. She stood beside the table for a moment and said quiet enough that only he could hear, "You didn't need to do all that." "I know," he said. "I could have handled it." "I know that too." He looked up at her. "You were handling it. You handled it better than anyone I've ever seen. Didn't mean you should have to handle it alone." Clara pressed her lips together. She nodded small once. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing illegal," Logan said, and there was just the edge of a smile in it, dry as the Montana air. "That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I've got right now." He looked at her steadily. "That boy's 20 years old. He's got 40, 50 years ahead of him. He's going to either keep being exactly what he was this morning for all of them, or something's going to reach him." He turned his coffee cup in his hand. "His father's money has kept every consequence off him his whole life. That can't go on. Somewhere this morning, something's got to start." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "His father came to money the way some people come to it. Not crooked, maybe, but hungry. You know the kind. They work so hard for it that they forget to teach their kids what it isn't." Logan looked at her. You sound like you feel sorry for him. I feel sorry for the boy he could have been, Clara said plain and simple. Not the one he is. Not yet. She tucked the coffee pot back against her apron. But I'm not going to pretend what he did in my diner today didn't happen. No, Logan said. Nobody's pretending that. What Logan did not say, and what Clara would not find out until later, was that while they were talking, while the diner was settling back into its ordinary rhythms, Benny had made contact with a journalist. Not a tabloid journalist, not someone looking for a salacious story about a rich kid throwing a fit. A woman in Billings who covered local business who had been following the Whitmore property group for reasons unrelated to Jackson Whitmore and his behavior in diners, who had 3 sources she'd been waiting to connect to something she could actually prove. Benny across the room, phone in his jacket pocket, nodded at Logan. Logan dipped his chin. Not a plan, just the beginning of one. The seed of a consequence planted in the morning of an ordinary Tuesday in a small-town diner in Montana. Jackson Whitmore was 20 miles down the road before the second half of his morning truly started. He didn't know yet. He was driving fast, always drove fast when he was angry. Another thing, his father paid for the tickets and the moving violations, and his friends were silent in the car beside him. Derek in the passenger seat with his head against the window. Marcus in the back with his phone in his hand, but not looking at it. Jackson gripped the wheel. I didn't do anything wrong, he said. Nobody answered him. She was completely out of the line. You were there. You saw it. She talked to me like I was nobody, and then had the nerve to Wihayat. Jackson, Marcus said from the back, flat, tired. What? Stop. Just stop talking. Don't tell me to. The man's name is Logan Carter, Marcus said. He was looking at his phone now. That was Logan Carter, the man who stood up from the table. I'm looking at him right now. He paused, scrolling. He's not just a biker, Jackson. He's been at every veterans benefit ride in this part of the state for 12 years. The chapter he runs does food drives, does fundraisers. They did a whole toy drive for the Billings Children's Hospital last December. He's got more connections in this state than your father has in California. Jackson said nothing. His hands were tighter on the wheel. And the woman, Marcus continued, and his voice had gone quieter now, more careful the way you speak when you're saying something out loud for the first time that you already know is going to change something. The waitress, her name's Clara Hayes. I found her on the county register. She's been Jackson. Her daughter died 3 years ago. She's got a 7-year-old grandson. A pause. She's been working 2 jobs. The Porsche did 92 on the empty Montana highway and said nothing. Derek, Marcus said. Derek against the window said nothing. Derek, tell him. Derek turned from the window. His face was closed and unhappy and older looking than it had been an hour ago. I don't know what you want me to say. Tell him what you told me outside the diner. A long pause, then Derek said, speaking to the windshield, I think we did something wrong. He stopped. He started again with more effort, like each word had to be pulled out separately. I think what you did, specifically what you did in there to that woman, I think that was wrong. I think it was really wrong. And I think, he stopped again, exhaled. I think when we didn't stop you, that was wrong too. The car was quiet. She was just doing her job, Derek said. She never did anything. She was just there. And her daughter died 3 years ago. And she's got this little kid, and she's working doubles to pay for it. And we walked in there and He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Jackson pressed the accelerator. 95, 100. Slow down, Marcus said. Jackson didn't slow down. Jackson, Marcus's voice was sharp. Slow down the car. The Porsche gradually dropped back to 80, then 70, then a legal 65, and they drove in silence for another 4 miles, while the Montana sky sat enormous and indifferent over all of them, and the Silver Spoon Diner disappeared into the distance behind them. Then Jackson said very quietly, she should have just, don't, Marcus said. Don't say it. Whatever you were going to say, don't. Another mile of silence. Then from the back seat, Marcus said something that neither of the other boys answered, because neither of them had an answer, and the question would stay in the car with them all the way to their destination, and then follow each of them separately into their individual nights. Marcus said, what are you going to tell your father? At the Silver Spoon, Logan Carter finished his coffee, left a tip that was nearly twice the bill, said goodbye to Clara, with a hand briefly on her arm. a thing that cost him nothing and that she would remember for months, and walked to the door. Benny held it open for him. Outside in the gravel lot, 13 men were already on their bikes, engines idling, the low rumble of them like a held breath. Logan stood in the doorway for a moment and looked back at the diner at Clara through the window, moving between the tables at Earl at the counter, going back to his second cup at Miriam, gathering her things at Ray, visible through the kitchen window, going back to his eggs. Just an ordinary Tuesday. Ordinary people in an ordinary place doing their ordinary work. And somewhere in him, in a place that had been carved out by years and miles and loss, in the particular education of a life lived mostly outdoors and at speed, Logan Carter felt something that he rarely felt anymore. Something he would not have called hope exactly, because he was too old and too honest for easy hope, but something in the neighborhood of it. He zipped his jacket, he put on his glasses, he walked to his bike. They pulled out of the Silver Spoon lot in single file, all 14 of them, and when the last one cleared the gravel and hit the asphalt, the sound of them together, the full roar of 14 engines catching the open road, rolled back across the diner like a wave. Inside, Clara Hayes paused. She looked up from the table she was clearing. She listened to the sound fade. Then she pressed her lips together just once in something that was not quite a smile and not quite a cry, but lived in the small, honest country between them. Then she went back to clearing the table, because there were still tables to clear. There was still a grandson who needed shoes. There was still an afternoon ahead, and then a night, and then a morning. And 60 miles south in a Porsche, doing 65 toward a destination that now felt considerably less certain than it had. An hour ago, Jackson Whitmore said nothing and drove, while Marcus's question sat in the back of the car like a stone. What are you going to tell your father? He didn't know yet, but somewhere in some small, new, uncomfortable corner of him, the more important question was already forming, slow and unbidden, and almost entirely against his will. What would he tell himself? Part 3, when Hell's Angels stood up. Marcus's question was still alive in the car when Jackson's phone rang. He knew the ringtone before he looked. It was the one he had assigned to his father 3 years ago, back when he thought it was funny to give Richard Whitmore the Imperial March from Star Wars. He didn't think it was funny anymore. He stared at the phone buzzing on the center console and felt something cold move through his chest. You gonna answer it? Derek asked. Jackson let it ring. 4 times. 5. Then it stopped. Then it started again. Marcus said from the back very carefully, he knows. He can't know. It's been 40 minutes. He knows, Marcus said again. Your father has known about things 40 minutes after they happened your entire life. You know this. Jackson picked up the phone. He looked at his father's name on the screen. He put it back down. It rang a 3rd time. This time Jackson answered. He said, Dad. And Richard Whitmore's voice came through the speaker and filled the car. And Richard Whitmore's voice, even at 61, even through a phone speaker on a Montana highway, was a voice that had closed real estate deals worth 9 figures and ended careers with a single sentence, and raised a boy entirely alone after his wife left when Jackson was 4. It was a voice that did not raise itself. It didn't need to. Its ordinary volume was enough. Tell me, Richard said, what happened this morning? It's not, Jackson started. Jackson, just the name? Just that, Jackson told him. Not the whole truth, not at first, the edited version. The version where he was the customer with legitimate complaints and the waitress had gotten mouthy and things had escalated and there were bikers involved and it was all slightly blown out of proportion. He told it fast, the way you tell a story when you're hoping speed will carry it past the parts you don't want examined. When he finished, there was a silence on the line. Then Richard said, you spat on her. Not a question. Jackson's fingers tightened on the wheel. Dad, you spat on a woman in a diner in front of a room full of people. Each sentence came out flat and separate, the way you lay bricks, each one deliberately placed on top of the last. And there were Hell's Angels present. They're a motorcycle club. They're not. I know who the Hell's Angels are, Jackson. A pause. And Logan Carter specifically. Jackson frowned. You know him. I know of him. Most people with business in this part of the country know of him. He is not someone. Richard stopped. Started again. That's not the point. The point is what you did. Another pause longer, and in that pause, Jackson could hear his father breathing, and he had the sudden disorienting feeling of being 6 years old again, standing in the principal's office before his father had learned to fix things with money, back when the fixes came in the form of 2 hours of silence, and then a conversation that Jackson could not get away from and could not survive. Where are you right now? 60 miles north of Billings. Turn around. Dad, turn the car around and go back to that diner right now, today. I'm not going back there. Those bikers will. Those bikers, Richard said, are the least of your problems this morning. The Porsche drove in silence for another quarter mile. Then Jackson said very quietly, because some part of him already knew the answer and needed to hear it confirmed. What does that mean? It means, Richard said, that I had a phone call 12 minutes ago from a woman named Sandra Chu, who works at the Billings Gazette, and wanted to know if I had a comment on my son's behavior at the Silver Spoon Diner in Cascade County this morning. It means she mentioned 2 other incidents by name Billings last year and the restaurant in Napa. And it means she had details about those incidents that I paid very significant sums of money to ensure would not be in anyone's possession anymore. The pause that followed was the kind that has temperature. This one was cold. Someone talked to her within the last hour, someone who knew about all 3. And since the only people who knew about all 3 were me, my lawyers, and the people we paid off, that means someone from this morning made a call, and those people decided that whatever we paid them wasn't enough after all. Jackson said nothing. Turn the car around, Richard said. Go back to that diner, and do not say one more word to anyone until I get there. The line went dead. In the seat beside him, Derek let out a long, slow breath. Your dad's coming to Montana. Yes, Jackson said. That's not good. No, Jackson said. It's not. He took the next exit. He turned the car around. The drive back felt nothing like the drive away. Going away from a thing you've done and heading back toward it are 2 entirely different experiences in the same body on the same road. And Jackson Whitmore, who had spent 20 years moving away from consequences as fast as his father's money could carry him, now drove toward one at 65 miles an hour with his jaw set and his hands wet on the wheel, and something working in his chest that he could not name and could not stop. Marcus in the back said nothing. Derek beside him said nothing. The 3 of them rode in silence, and the silence had a different quality now than the silence on the way out. The silence on the way out had been the silence of boys who didn't want to say the wrong thing. The silence on the way back was the silence of boys who were beginning to understand that the wrong thing had already been said and done and witnessed, and that the particular luxury of erasure they'd relied on their whole lives was this morning not available. They pulled back into the Silver Spoon lot 45 minutes after they'd left it. From outside, the diner looked unchanged. The same cracked neon, the same gravel, the same ordinary Tuesday morning face of a place that had been open and unchanged since before Jackson Whitmore was born, and would be open and unchanged long after he was forgotten. But inside, when he pushed through the door and the little bell jangled, and this time he let the door fall shut quietly behind him, the diner was different, or he was different in it, or both. Clara was at the counter talking to Earl, and she looked up when the bell rang, and when she saw who it was, something moved through her face, not fear, not anger. Something more complicated than either the expression of a woman who has already processed the worst part of her morning and is now simply waiting to find out what comes next. Earl turned on his stool. He looked at Jackson for a long moment. Then he turned back to his coffee. Logan Carter was still there. That surprised Jackson more than anything. He'd assumed the bikers would be long gone back on the road, the morning's interruption already disappearing in the rearview. But Logan was at the corner table alone now, the rest of his crew dispersed to various points around the diner or through the window visible outside with their bikes. Logan had a fresh cup of coffee and a legal pad in front of him and a phone to his ear, and when Jackson walked in, he looked up from the pad and met the boy's eyes across the room and said something brief into the phone and then set it down. He did not look surprised. He did not look satisfied the way some men look when they have been proven right about something. He just looked at Jackson with those patient gray eyes and waited. Jackson walked toward him. His friend stayed by the door. He stopped at the edge of the corner table. He stood there. He didn't know what he'd intended to say. He'd been going over words the whole drive back, arranging and rearranging them, and none of the arrangements had felt right, and they still didn't. So he stood there, and the silence grew, and Logan let it grow, and finally Jackson said, "My father's on his way." "I know," Logan said. Jackson blinked. "How do you..." Sandra called me after she called him. He said it without any show, just information. You're the one who you gave her the story. I gave her the names of some people who had their own stories to tell, Logan said. There's a difference. I'm not a journalist. I don't make things up. I just pointed her toward people who'd been waiting a long time for someone to ask. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Your father has been very good at making things disappear. It turns out that things are harder to disappear when more than one person is talking at the same time. Jackson felt the anger move through him, hot and familiar, and for just a second he let himself have it. The outrage, the violation, the sense of having been ambushed. And then something under the anger shifted some more honest thing, and the anger went thin and unconvincing, even to himself. Because the woman those things had happened to was standing 20 feet behind him. And the woman he had spat on this morning was standing behind the counter, watching him with tired, careful eyes. And the anger he was reaching for required him to believe that he was the victim of this morning, and some new, painful, inconvenient part of him was finding that very difficult to believe. He pulled out the chair across from Logan and sat down. Not invited, just sat. Logan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He's going to offer her money, Jackson said. My father, that's what he does. He's going to walk in here and shake her hand and pull out a number. Yes, Logan said, I expect he will. And you think that's wrong? I think that depends on whether the number is the end of the story or the beginning of the cover-up, Logan said. Money given to a person who's been wronged without strings because it's the right thing that's not wrong. Money given to buy silence and make the powerful man comfortable, that's a different thing. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised both of them. I don't know which one my father will do. Logan looked at him, and for the first time since the moment he'd stood up from his chair, the look he gave the boy had something new in it. Not warmth exactly, not approval, just attention. The focused attention of a man who has just heard something true come out of a mouth that's been lying all morning. That's the most honest thing you've said today, Logan said. It might be the most honest thing I've said in a year, Jackson said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he pressed his lips together hard and looked at the table and waited for it to pass. The diner had gone quiet again. Not the wrong kind of quiet, not the held breath quiet of violence on its way, but the listening quiet of ordinary people who have found themselves inside an extraordinary morning and are watching it resolve itself in real time. Clara had come out from behind the counter. She moved to the end of the room with her coffee pot, refilling cups she'd already refilled, keeping herself near enough to hear, without making it obvious she was listening. Earl watched her do it with the knowing half-smile of a man who has spent 79 years watching women be much smarter about a situation than the men in it. What do you want me to do? Jackson said to Logan. Right now, before my father gets here. What do you actually want? Logan was quiet for a long beat, not building to something, just actually thinking the way men who've learned to be careful with words take a moment before they use them. I want you to go over there, he said finally, and talk to her. Won't apologize, not yet, and an apology right now would be about making you feel better, and you don't deserve to feel better yet. Just talk to her, ask her something. Not about what happened, ask her about the diner, ask her about herself, ask her something that requires you to listen to her answer. Jackson looked at him. That's it. That's the beginning of it, Logan said. Jackson sat for another moment, then he pushed back the chair. He stood up. He turned toward Clara. She saw him coming. Her hand tightened on the coffee pot. But she didn't move away from him, which, given the morning she'd had, was an act of courage that went entirely unannounced. Jackson stopped about 4 feet from her. He said, Can I ask you something? Clara said, You can ask. How long have you worked here? It was a small question, almost too small. Clara looked at him for a second, checking the question for traps, for condescension, for any of the edges she'd learned to watch for this morning. Finding none, she said, 22 years in November. Jackson nodded. He said, What's the hardest part? Clara tilted her head slightly. The question had genuinely surprised her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, The feet. Everyone thinks it's the customers. She glanced over at the spot where his eggs had ended up on the table. Usually it's the feet. Something moved through Jackson's face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the place where a smile would be if he had earned one yet. I'm sorry about your daughter, he said. I read it on the drive back. I'm sorry. Clara looked at him for a long time. The coffee pot was still in her hand and her knuckles were white around the handle, and she was doing the thing she'd done all morning, the pressing down, the holding together. Her name was Marie, Clara said quietly. She would have been 31 next month. Jackson said nothing. He was learning in this moment the particular courage of keeping your mouth shut when the wrong word is right there and the right thing is silence. Tommy's got her eyes, Clara said. She said it mostly to herself, then she looked at Jackson again, steady. He's the reason I'm still standing here. Not because of you, because of him. I know, Jackson said. Do you, Kyle? No, he admitted. Not really, but I want to. Clara looked at him one more time long, the look of a woman who has spent 5 decades reading people and knows the difference between a performance and a beginning. Then she nodded once and went back to her tables. When Jackson turned around, Logan was watching him from the corner table. He didn't say anything. He just gave a small nod and picked up his coffee and looked out the window. Richard Whitmore arrived 3 hours and 17 minutes later. He was not a tall man, but he was built in the way certain self-made men are built, compactly, densely, with an energy that arrived in the room slightly before he did. He was 61, silver-haired, with a handshake that he'd perfected over 40 years of deals. He wore good clothes that didn't look expensive, which was the most expensive thing about them. He walked into the Silver Spoon Diner and looked around the room with the quick, assessing look of a man who has walked into 10,000 rooms and immediately identified who he needed to talk to. He found Logan Carter first. Something in the look they exchanged, 2 men of roughly the same generation, both of them carrying their years visibly. Both of them, speaking the same unspoken language of consequence and responsibility, lasted about 4 seconds and communicated more than most conversations. Then Richard Whitmore walked to the counter and sat down across from Clara Hayes. Jackson stayed where he was at the corner table across from Logan. He watched his father talk to Clara. He couldn't hear everything, but he could see. He could see his father lean forward, elbows on the counter, the posture of a man not positioning himself above someone, but putting himself level. He could see Clara listen. He could see his father reach into his jacket and pull out not a checkbook Jackson had expected a checkbook, but a business card which he placed on the counter without any flourish. He could see Clara look at the card, then he could see her push it back across the counter. Something moved through Richard Whitmore's face. He wasn't used to that. Not the gesture of someone who couldn't afford to say no, but the gesture of someone who had considered it and decided no was the right answer. Richard said something. Clara responded. He said something else. Clara shook her head. Then Clara said something that made Richard go very still. Jackson was on his feet without deciding to stand. He crossed the room, he came close enough to hear and stopped. Clara was saying, "Money cannot teach my grandson that people matter. It cannot undo the lesson he learned today watching the way your son spoke to me. You can't buy that back, Mr. Whitmore. I'm not saying that to be cruel to you. I'm saying it because I think part of you already knows it." Richard Whitmore sat on that bar stool for a long moment without speaking. He was looking at the counter at the cards she'd pushed back or to him at his own hands, the hands that had built the thing that had failed to build his son, and his face was doing something that Jackson had never once in his life seen it do. His father looked like he was going to cry. He didn't. Richard Whitmore had not cried since his wife left 20 years ago, and he was not going to start in a diner in Montana. But the effort of not crying was visible in a way that made Jackson feel for the first time in his 20 years that his father was not a fixed and permanent thing, not a resource or a shield or an institution, but a man. Just a man who had worked so hard at the wrong things for so long that he'd gotten very far before noticing what he'd left out. Jackson sat down on the stool beside his father. Richard looked over at him. His eyes were dry, but his face was open in a way Jackson had never seen, and it was frightening the way true things are frightening when you encounter them for the first time. "She's right," Richard said, quietly, not to the room, just to his son. "I can't buy it back." "No," Jackson said, "you can't. I've been buying things back your whole life." Richard looked at the counter. "I told myself it was easier, faster, cleaner. Get in front of the problem, make it go away. Nobody gets hurt worse than they already are." He was quiet. "I told myself you would figure it out, that boys need time." "I didn't figure anything out," Jackson said. "I just got worse." Richard nodded slowly. "I know." "Why didn't you," Jackson started. "Stopped. The question was too large and too old, and this was not the place for it. He let it go. I'm going to ask you something, Richard said to Clara, and he turned to face her, and when he looked at her this time, it was not the look of a powerful man looking at someone he can smooth out of his way. It was the look of a person looking at another person. Not a check, not a card, not anything that goes away. I want to ask you what you think he needs. My son, you've watched him all morning. What do you think he actually needs? The diner was listening, everyone in it was listening, and they were not pretending not to. Clara took her time. She wiped down the counter slowly, thinking in no hurry to give an answer she hadn't finished forming. Then she set down her cloth and she said, he needs to be uncomfortable for a while. Not punished, not humiliated, just uncomfortable. He needs to be somewhere that doesn't make room for who he's been. He needs to be around people who need things from him that money can't provide. She looked at Richard steadily, and he needs someone to hold him to it. Not forever, just long enough for it to become real to him. Richard Whitmore sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at his son. Jackson felt the look. It was a different look than his father had given him in 20 years of fixes and cover-ups and managed consequences. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't disappointment, and it wasn't the calculating look of a man already thinking 3 steps ahead. It was something simpler. It was a father looking at his son and finally seeing him clearly enough to be afraid. Would you, Richard said to Clara, and his voice had gone careful with the question, be willing, would you consider letting him work here for a while? The diner stopped, actually stopped. Earl set down his fork. 2 of the remaining bikers who'd been talking quietly near the window went silent. Even Ray, through the kitchen window, had gone still. Clara looked at Richard. She looked at Jackson. She looked back at Richard. He's not a good worker, she said, based on this morning. No, Richard agreed. He doesn't know how to do anything useful. That's accurate. And he'll be difficult, she said. For a while, at least. He's been difficult his whole life from the sound of it, and that doesn't turn off overnight. All of that is true, Richard said. Clara was quiet. Then she said, if he works here, same as anyone else. Same hours, same rules, same tips, or lack of them, depending on how he does. He doesn't get special treatment because of who you are, and he doesn't get rescued when it gets hard. She looked at Jackson when she said the last part. And I won't be soft on him. That's not cruelty. It's just, this is my diner and I run it right. I wouldn't want it any other way, Richard said. Jackson said nothing. He was looking at Clara with an expression that nobody in the diner, not Logan, not Earl, not his own father, had seen on his face all morning. It was raw and young and slightly terrified, and it was the most authentic thing he'd worn since he walked through the door. All right, Clara said. She picked up her cloth again. She went back to wiping the counter. He starts Monday, 6 a.m. If he's late, the door stays locked. We don't do late here. He'll be there, Richard said. Make sure he doesn't drive the Porsche, Clara said without looking up. It'll irritate the regulars. Earl at the end of the counter made a sound that was nearly a laugh. He covered it with a cough. Logan Carter, watching all of this from the corner table, picked up his phone and made a call. When it connected, he said simply, Sandra, hold the peace. A pause. Because something different is happening, something better. He listened for a moment. Because I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a man running away from what he did and a man turning to face it. Another pause. Give it time. If I'm wrong, I'll call you back and you can run it twice as long. But give it time. He hung up. He looked at the ceiling for a second, just 1 second, a man checking himself against something he didn't have words for. Then he looked back across the room to where Richard and Jackson Whitmore sat side by side at the counter, and Clara Hayes moved around them the way water moves around something that has been placed in it, neither avoiding them nor accommodating them, but simply continuing her work. Boone appeared beside Logan, quiet as always, and said, You pulling the story. Holding it, Logan said. Not pulling it. There's a difference. You trust the old man? Logan thought about it. I trust that he's scared, he said. That's enough for now. Scared the right way is a beginning. He drank the last of his coffee. His son said something at that table earlier. He said he didn't know which kind of man his father was, whether the money would be offered clean or with strings. He set the cup down. That's a 20-year-old asking a real question about his own father for what I think might be the first time in his life. I'm not walking away from that. And if the father disappoints him, Then Sandra runs her story with 2 more weeks of material, Logan said. And we make sure every chapter from here to the coast knows the Whitmore name. He stood up, pulling on his jacket. But I don't think that's what happens. He was almost right, not completely, not in the way anyone in that room was expecting. Because what Richard Whitmore did next was the thing that nobody, not Logan, not Clara, not Jackson himself had seen coming. He stood up from the counter. He buttoned his jacket. He pulled out his wallet. He placed what looked like a very large amount of cash on the counter. Not a bribe, not an envelope, just cash laid flat, no explanation, no strings, and said to Clara, "For the people the Billings incident affected. Not for you, I suspect you'd throw it at me, but for them, if you'd be willing to pass it along. No message, no card, just they were owed." Clara looked at the money. "That's not enough," she said. "No," Richard said, "it's not, but it's what I have on me today. There'll be more." "Yes," he said, "there will." He turned then, and he looked at Logan Carter across the room, and the two men held each other's gaze for a long moment, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not a deal and was not a threat and was not forgiveness, which was too soon for anyone, but was something more like acknowledgement. Two men, different roads, the same age, both of them, standing inside a mistake and figuring out in real time whether they were going to do the right thing with it. Logan gave one nod, short, clean. Richard returned it. Then Richard Whitmore put his hand on his son's shoulder. Not a grip, not a hold, just a hand resting there, the weight of it, both ordinary and enormous. And he said very quietly, so quietly it barely made it past the two of them, "I'm sorry, Jackson. Not for today, for before today, for all the times I made it easy for you to be this." Jackson felt the hand on his shoulder. He felt his throat close. He looked at the counter. "Monday," he said after a moment. 6 a.m. 6 a.m., Richard confirmed. Jackson looked over at Clara. Clara was already moving down the counter. She had coffee to pour, and tables to turn, and a grandson to pick up from school at 3:15, and approximately 40 things still left to do before this day was done. But as she passed, without stopping, without making a production of it, she set a glass of water on the counter in front of Jackson. Just water, like he was any other customer, like he was someone worth bringing water to. That small thing, that ordinary, unremarkable, quietly radical, small thing, was the thing that got him. All morning, through the humiliation and the confrontation and his father's arrival and the cash on the counter and every word spoken in every direction, all of it had been manageable. Because it had been loud. Because loud things you can push back against. Because as long as something's coming at you hard, you have something to push against, and the pushing keeps you from feeling. But a glass of water set down gently, because the person setting it down had decided, in spite of every reason not to treat him like a person that he could not push back against. He stared at the glass. His eyes were burning. He pressed the heels of his hands against his knees and breathed through it. Behind him, so quietly he almost didn't catch it, he heard Logan Carter say to Boone, in the tone of a man reporting on something he's been watching carefully and is now fairly confident about, "There it is." "There what is?" Boone asked. "The thing that was missing," Logan said. "In him. It was missing all morning, and I was starting to wonder if it was there at all." He picked up his jacket. "But it's there." "What is it?" Logan looked at the boy sitting at the counter with a glass of water in front of him and his hands pressed to his knees and his shoulders doing the particular thing shoulders do when a person is fighting their own face. "Shame," Logan said. "Real shame. Not the kind that makes you angry, the kind that makes you want to be different." He pulled the jacket on. "That's what you can work with. That's the only thing you can ever work with." He walked to the door. He put on his glasses. He pushed through into the ordinary air of an ordinary Tuesday that had turned out to be, for a small number of people in a small Montana diner, something considerably larger than ordinary. The bell jangled above him as he went. Outside, his crew was ready. 14 bikes, 14 men, the long road ahead and behind them and all around them in every direction, the way the road always was for men like them. Benny fell into step beside him and said, "We good. We're good," Logan said. "You think the kid's actually going to show up Monday?" Logan swung onto his bike. He turned the key. He felt the engine catch under him, the familiar sound of it, the vibration of it, the road readiness of it that had been the closest thing to home he'd known for 30 years. "I think," Logan said over the engine, "that we're going to find out." He pulled out of the lot. 13 bikes followed. They hit the road in a single line heading east, the sound of them carrying back across the gravel lot and through the thin walls of the Silver Spoon Diner, filling the room one last time before fading. Inside, Jackson Whitmore sat at the counter. He picked up the glass of water. He drank it. He set the glass down quietly the way Logan had set down his coffee cup that morning, deliberate, careful, the small, practiced courtesy of someone learning for the first time to be gentle with the things around him. It was a very small beginning. But every real thing starts small. That's the only way it works. The big version of the thing, the changed man, the honest life, the earned respect that comes later if you do the small thing first. Monday was 5 days away, and for the first time in his 20 years, Jackson Whitmore was counting. He showed up at 5:57 on Monday morning, not because he was eager, not because he'd had some overnight transformation that made him the kind of person who bounces out of bed before 6 with a purpose and a smile. He showed up at 5:57 because he'd been awake since 3, lying on the ceiling of the motel room his father had booked for him. Not the nicest motel in the county. Richard had been specific about that. Nothing with a fitness center or a hot tub or room service, a clean and ordinary place where the sheets were fresh and the television was small, and there was nothing at all to insulate him from his own thoughts, and at some point the lying there became more unbearable than the going. So he got up and he dressed in clothes his father had also been specific about, jeans and a plain shirt. Nothing with a logo, nothing that cost more than the people he'd be working beside could afford, and he drove his father's rented Chevy trucks to the Silver Spoon Diner and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before he went in. The diner was already lit. Clara was already there, had been there since 5, the way she was every morning, because the bread delivery came at 5:15 and the coffee had to be on by 5:30. And there was always something that needed doing before the first customer pushed through the door. She heard the Chevy pull up. She heard the door open and close. She heard the boots on the gravel, different from the Porsche boy's expensive sneakers. These were actual work boots, which meant his father had either taken him shopping or given him a list, and when she heard the knock at the side door, the employee door, not the customer door, which meant he'd gone around the building to find it, which meant he'd paid attention. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to let him in. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. "Boy, you're early," she said. "I didn't want to be late," he said. "Come in then." She put him to work immediately the way she put every new person to work. No orientation speech, no tour, no hand-holding, just handed him a broom and pointed at the floor and said, "Sweep first, then I'll show you the coffee station." And she went back to her bread delivery. Jackson stood there with the broom for a second, and if you'd been watching, and Ray was watching through the pass-through from the kitchen, quiet and expressionless, you could see the exact moment the boy decided not to say anything and just started sweeping. Ray turned back to his prep work. He didn't say anything to Claire about it, but his expression, if you'd caught it in the right light, had shifted a fraction of an inch in a direction that was not quite approval and not quite surprise, but lived somewhere between them. The first hour was the hardest. Jackson swept and mopped and learned the coffee station and broke a glass, which Clara made him clean up himself without offering to help, and burned his hand on the edge of the commercial coffee maker, which Clara saw and asked once if he needed first aid, and when he said no, accepted the answer and moved on. She didn't coddle him. She didn't punish him. She simply treated him the way she treated everyone who worked in her diner, which was with the assumption that they were capable adults who could figure things out if given the chance. The first customers came at 6:30, a ranch hand and his teenage daughter regular as the sunrise. They sat in Clara's section, which this morning was Jackson's section under Clara's supervision. "Go take their order," Clara said. Jackson picked up the pad. He walked to the table. He stood at the edge of it and said, "Good morning," and waited. The ranch hand, whose name was Dale, and who had eaten at the Silver Spoon 3 mornings a week for 11 years, looked up at Jackson with the flat, unhurried gaze of a man who has no strong feelings about who brings him his coffee as long as it arrives. "Morning," Dale said. "You knew?" "Yes, sir," Jackson said, and the "sir" came out naturally, which surprised Jackson more than it surprised Dale. "Coffee to start," Dale said. "Black, and whatever she wants." He nodded at his daughter, a girl of about 15 who was looking at her phone. "The strawberry pancakes," the girl said without looking up. "And the pancakes," Jackson repeated, writing. "Got it." He went back to the coffee station. He poured the coffee. He carried it to the table and set it down and did not spill it and said, "I'll have your pancakes out shortly," the way Clara had told him to say it, and went back to the kitchen. Ray looked at him through the pass-through. "Order," he said. "Strawberry pancakes," Jackson said, "and a coffee's already out." Ray wrote it down on the ticket. Jackson watched him for a second and said, "Do I put the ticket on that thing?" and pointed at the ticket rail. "After I call it," Ray said. "Okay," Jackson said. He went back out to the floor. It was this small, undramatic, functional exchange new person experienced. Cook, neither of them performing anything, just doing a job that Clara, who had been watching from behind the counter, turned away from, with something she decided not to examine too closely, because examining it might make her feel something generous toward the boy before she was ready to. By 8 o'clock, Jackson had taken orders for 14 people, refilled coffee 12 times, cleared 3 tables, and forgotten to bring ketchup twice. He'd apologized both times without being told to. He'd also, in the middle of the breakfast rush, been called over by a table of 4 construction workers and addressed in a tone that was objectively not that different from the tone he'd used on Clara a week ago. Impatient, a little dismissive, treating him as a function rather than a person. And he had stood there and taken the order and said, "I'll get that right out," and walked to the kitchen. And Ray, who had been watching, saw the exact moment in the boy's walk where he processed the irony and it hit him, and his shoulders went up for half a second and then came down, and he kept going. Ray told Claire about it later. He told it simply the way Ray told everything, no editorializing, just what happened. Clara listened and said, "Good," and that was all she said about it. By 9:30, Jackson's feet were hurting. He didn't know that was going to happen. He'd spent 20 years on feet that had never ached because 20 years of his life had been spent in situations where you could sit down whenever you wanted to. Standing behind a counter running back and forth across linoleum for 3 hours straight was a completely different use of a human body than anything he had previously asked his to do, and by 9:30 the soles of his feet were sending him detailed complaints that he had no way to address because Clara was still moving, and if Clara was still moving, he was still moving. He caught himself thinking around 9:45 that this was stupid, that his feet hurt, and this was not his life, and he could walk out right now and nothing, literally nothing, would stop him except his own choice. The thought sat in him for about 30 seconds, fully formed, comfortable, offering him its hand. Then he thought about the glass of water. He didn't know why that was the thing that came back. Out of everything that had happened in that diner a week ago, Logan's voice, his father's face, Clara's words about Marie, it was the glass of water that his mind returned to in the difficult moments. The simple, uncharged, unremarkable act of a woman who had every reason to treat him like less than nothing, and had instead, without comment, brought him water. He kept going. The morning rush ended around 10:30, and the diner went into the quiet between services, and Clara came to stand beside him at the counter and said, "How are your feet?" "Fine," Jackson said. "They're not fine," she said. "That's fine too. They'll get better after a week." "A week," he repeated. "Everyone's due," she said. She poured herself a cup of coffee, the first one she'd had all morning. Jackson realized she hadn't stopped long enough for one before now, and she stood beside him at the counter and drank it. "You did all right this morning." "I forgot the ketchup twice." "You apologized for it," she said. "That counts. Some people work here 3 months and never apologize for anything." Jackson was quiet. Then he said, "Ray watches everything." "Ray's watched everything for 19 years. You get used to it." "He doesn't say much." "Ray says exactly as much as something is worth to him," Clara said. "It's the most efficient communication system I've ever worked with." She drank her coffee. "He told me about the table this morning, the 4 men." Jackson looked at the counter. "He said you handled it right," Clara said. Something moved in Jackson's chest. He didn't say anything. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel good about yourself," Clara said, and her voice was clear and direct the way it always was, no cruelty but no softness either, just the honest thing delivered honestly. "I'm telling you because you should know what right looks like when you do it, just like you should know what wrong looks like. You spent a week last week getting told what wrong looks like. This morning you did something right. That's worth knowing." Jackson nodded. He was looking at his hands on the counter, the hands that had been in his pockets a week ago when they should have been picking up a napkin. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Clara," she said. "Clara." He stopped. He started again. Last week I said things I can't take back. And I did. He stopped again. He was not good at this, had never once in his life been required to be good at this, and the language of accountability was foreign in his mouth the way a new language is foreign, stumbling and slow. I did something I can't take back. And I want to say I'm sorry, and I know that saying it doesn't undo it, Clara said. No, it doesn't. But I want to say it anyway. All right, Clara said. She set down her cup. She turned to look at him fully, the way she'd looked at him across the diner that first morning, and the look had the same quality it had then, seeing him completely not letting the image be managed. You can say it. He said, I'm sorry. He said it plain, no performance in it, just the words at their most stripped down. I'm sorry for every word I said to you. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry I didn't pick up the napkin. He paused. I think about the napkin a lot. It's strange. Out of everything, I think about the napkin. Clara was quiet for a moment. Why do you think that is? She asked, and the question was genuine. Jackson thought about it. Because it was a choice, he said slowly. Everything before it, I told myself I was just reacting. I was just being who I always was. It just happened. But the napkin was a choice. You were standing right there. Logan was right there. Everyone was right there. And I looked at the napkin, and I looked at all of you, and I chose not to. He exhaled. That was the choice I made. Clara said, yes, it was. And I couldn't have made a different one then, he said. I know that's not an excuse. I know it doesn't matter why. But I don't think I knew how. I don't think I'd ever been taught how. He said it carefully, not using it as a defense, just saying it the way you say a true thing that also happens to be uncomfortable. My father fixed everything. I never had to. I never built the muscle, the one that makes you bend down and pick something up even when you don't want to. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that he would carry for years, that he would tell people about in rooms he couldn't yet imagine, in contexts he couldn't yet see. She said, that muscle Jackson, the one you're talking about, that's not a character trait you're born with or not. That's a practice. You build it the same way you build any other muscle. You use it when it's hard. You use it especially when it's hard. And eventually it gets easier. She picked up her coffee cup. That's what you're here for, to build the muscle. She walked away. She went to the kitchen to check on lunch prep. And Jackson Whitmore stood at the counter of the Silver Spoon Diner with his aching feet and his coffee-stained shirt and the memory of a napkin on the floor. And he felt something he had never felt in 20 years of easy living. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The second week was harder than the first in different ways. The physical part got marginally better. His feet adjusted his body, learned the rhythms of the floor, the back and forth of the tables. The shorthand with Ray that developed not through conversation but through repeated shared work, the understanding of what went where and when. But the social architecture of the diner, the community of it, the web of relationships between regulars and staff that had been built over decades, that was harder to enter than the physical work, and Jackson found to his genuine surprise that he wanted to enter it. That for the first time in his life, he was in a place that required things of him he actually had to grow to provide. Earl came in every morning. At first, he acknowledged Jackson's existence with nothing more than the positioning of his coffee cup, pulling it to the edge of the counter so Jackson could reach it, which was courtesy of a kind Jackson had never in his life noticed or appreciated until now. By the end of the second week, Earl was saying morning when Jackson poured the first cup, and one day without looking up from his paper said, little more coffee when you get a chance. And Jackson brought it, and Earl said, thank you. And Jackson said, of course. And it was the most ordinary exchange in the world, and something about its ordinariness was the point. Miriam, the teacher, came in on Thursdays for her late breakfast before her afternoon shift, and she watched Jackson work with the careful attention she gave everything. And on the third Thursday, she said to Claire at the counter, loud enough for Jackson to hear if he was listening, he's getting better. She didn't say it to him, she said it about him. And the fact that it was said about and not to, that Clara heard it and nodded and didn't make a production of it, meant more to Jackson than a direct compliment would have. It meant it was true. The hardest day was the Tuesday of the third week. He was clearing a table near the window when the door opened and a group of 4 young men came in loud and laughing. And the laughter was the specific laughter of people who have been up too late and are running on the particular entitled energy of young men who have never been told no. And Jackson recognized it immediately because he had been the source of that exact laughter approximately 3 weeks ago in this exact room. He stood with a bus pan in his hands and watched them choose a table. They chose the big one in the middle, the one that seats 6, and he felt something move through him that was complicated and uncomfortable, and not entirely unlike looking at a photograph of yourself from an era you'd rather not remember. Clara appeared beside him. She said quietly, "You okay?" "Yeah," he said. "You don't have to take that table." He looked at her. "Is that an option?" "Today it is," she said, "because I'm saying it is." He thought about it for 3 full seconds. "No," he said. "I'll take it." He walked over. He stood at the edge of the table with his order pad. The boys were still laughing among themselves, not noticing him yet. He waited. He waited the way Clara had waited for him, patient and contained, giving them the space to notice on their own. One of them looked up. "Hey," the boys said, "coffee to start. And can we get like a real menu? This laminated thing is..." "That's the menu," Jackson said. "Come on. Plain. The specials are on the board. Coffee coming right up." The boy blinked. He'd been expecting maybe either aggressive servility or pushback. He hadn't been expecting a simple statement of fact delivered with no apology and no edge. "Oh," he said. "Okay, thanks." Jackson went and got the coffee. He brought it back and poured it around the table. And one of the boys, the loudest one who reminded Jackson uncomfortably of himself, said, without looking up from his phone, "Can you come back in like 10? We're not ready." "Of course," Jackson said, and he went back to the counter. Clara was watching. She said nothing. She didn't need to. He took their order 10 minutes later and brought the food 20 minutes after that, and the loud one complained that his eggs were too done, and Jackson said, "I'll have Ray make you another set," and went to the kitchen and said to Ray, "Can we redo the eggs on table 4? And Ray said without any expression at all, "What's wrong with them?" And Jackson said, "He says they're too done," and Ray looked at the plate that had come back, looked at Jackson and said, "They're fine." And then Ray made another set anyway because that's what you do, and Jackson brought them out and the boy ate them without saying thank you. And Jackson cleared the table when they were done and found a $6 tip on a $40 bill and pocketed it with the same feeling he imagined Clara felt every day of her working life. That afternoon, while the diner was quiet, he sat at the counter with a cup of coffee and thought about tips. He thought about how many tables Clara turned in a day and what the average tip probably worked out to, and from that, he thought about Tommy's shoes. And from that, he thought about 22 years of this, the repetition of it, the patience of it, and he put his elbows on the counter and pressed his face into his hands for a moment. Ray, passing behind the counter with a supply order, said without stopping, "First month's always the worst." "Does it get better?" Jackson asked into his hands. "No," Ray said. He kept walking. "You get better." Jackson laughed. It surprised him. It came up out of nowhere, a real laugh, short and involuntary, the first one he'd produced since before that Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago. He took his face out of his hands. Ray had disappeared into the back. At the end of the 4th week, Richard Whitmore called. He called every few days not to manage things, or that was what he said, though Jackson suspected the first 2 calls had some management in them. But by the 3rd and 4th calls, something had shifted in the way his father spoke to him. There was less of the brisk efficiency that had characterized every conversation of Jackson's childhood, the sense of problems being assessed and solutions being deployed. There was more pausing, more listening to the silence after Jackson finished talking before Richard started, more questions that didn't have a built-in expected answer. This call, the one at the end of the 4th week, Richard said, "Tell me something that happened today." Jackson thought about it. "There was a woman with a baby," he said. "Came in around 9. The baby was fussing. She was clearly exhausted. She knocked over her water glass, trying to keep the kid from grabbing the salt shaker, and water went everywhere, and her face, Dad. Her face when she looked up at me was exactly the kind of face that expects to be looked at like she's an inconvenience." He paused. "And I just cleaned it up. Said, 'Happens all the time, don't worry about it,' and got her a new glass and a stack of napkins and asked if the baby wanted some crackers. We keep crackers." He paused again, and she looked at me like I'd done something remarkable. And it wasn't remarkable. It was nothing. It took 30 seconds. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It wasn't nothing to her." "No," Jackson said, "it wasn't. How does that feel, Richard asked, when it's not nothing to someone? Jackson had to think about it. He'd never been asked that question before, had never thought about the feeling of being useful to someone who needed something as anything worth examining. Good, he said finally. It feels like something real, like I did an actual thing in the world. Yeah, Richard said, and his voice had something in it that Jackson hadn't heard in his father's voice in a very long time, maybe ever. Yeah, I know that feeling. A pause. Do you? Jackson said. Not for a long time, Richard said. I used to, when I was starting out, before the money got big enough to put people between me and the actual work, between me and the people the work affected. He was quiet. I forgot that feeling existed. I forgot to teach it to you because I'd forgotten it myself. It was the most honest thing his father had ever said to him. Jackson sat with it. I didn't know, Jackson said, that you'd forgotten it. I didn't know I'd forgotten it either, Richard said. Not until a woman in Montana pushed a business card back across the counter at me. The fifth week brought a twist that nobody in the diner had anticipated. Logan Carter came back, not with his crew this time. He came alone on a Wednesday afternoon in the quiet hour between lunch and dinner, and he came in the customer door and he sat down at the counter, and Jackson was the one who brought the coffee. He set the cup down. Logan picked it up. He drank from it without comment. You stayed, Logan said. I stayed just out, Jackson said. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure either. Jackson leaned against the counter opposite him. The second week I almost didn't. There was a table that... He stopped. He tried to figure out how to say it. They reminded me of me, he said, the way I was, and I had to take their order, and I wanted to walk out so bad I could feel it in my hands. But you didn't. Clara told me I didn't have to take the table, and I wanted to refuse it. I wanted her to let me off, and then I just didn't want that more than I wanted to take the table. He picked up a cloth and wiped the counter just to have something to do with his hands. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Logan said. I didn't like them, Jackson said. The boys at the table. I served them the whole meal and I didn't like them, and I was perfectly polite to them the whole time. He paused. I didn't know you could do that. Be polite to someone you don't like because that's just what you do, that it's not about how you feel about them. Logan looked at him over the coffee cup. How old are you? 20. You're learning that at 20, Logan said. There are men 3 times your age who never figured that out. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Can I ask you something? You can ask. That morning when you stood up, he kept his eyes on the counter. Was it because of Clara specifically, or would you have stood up for anyone? Logan thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way he approached most questions, not rushing to the answer that sounded best. Both, he said. Clara, I know. Clara, I have a particular regard for her, for who she is, for what she's carried. So there was that, but if it had been a stranger, someone I'd never seen before, he set the cup down. Yeah, still. Why? Because what you were doing wasn't about her specifically. You would have done it to anyone you could get away with doing it to. And that means it was about something in you, not something about her. And the thing in you, Chayo, he said it carefully without judgment, as a simple observation. The thing in you that needed to find someone to be small so you could feel big, that's something that left alone keeps growing. It hurts more people. It becomes who you are. He picked up the coffee again. I've seen it become who men are. I didn't want to watch it happen to one more. Jackson was quiet. Did you know it would work, that I'd come back, that my father would... No, Logan said simply. I had no idea. Your father could have walked in that door and put a lawyer between himself and Clara and made the whole thing go away again. He paused. I thought he might. He thought about it, Jackson said. I know he did. He had a partner call that night, and the partner laid out the options, and one of the options was, yeah, lawyer settlement, non-disclosure done. What made him choose different? Jackson looked at this counter. She pushed the card back, he said. He told me later, he said he's had people refuse his money before, but usually they refuse it because they want more. She refused it because she didn't think money was the answer. And he said something about the way she said it, money cannot teach my grandson that people matter, that he drove the whole way back to his hotel that night, thinking about that sentence. A pause. He said it was the first time in years someone had told him something he didn't know. Logan nodded slowly. How was he your father? Different, Jackson said. And then because it was true, and the truth was what this place had started to make him speak. Scared, I think. He spent 40 years building something and then found out it had a hole in it he didn't know about, and everything he thought he'd secured had been leaking out through the whole time. Logan said that's a hard thing to find out at 61. Yeah, Jackson said, but he found it. He wiped the counter again. Some people don't. No, Logan agreed. Some people don't. Clara came out of the back room and saw Logan at the counter, and something warm and tired moved through her face, the expression of a person encountering something familiar and reliable in a world that mostly isn't. Logan, she said. Clara, he said. Good coffee. Same coffee it always is, she said, but she smiled saying it. That's what I mean, Logan said. She poured herself a cup and stood on her side of the counter, and the three of them, the biker, the waitress, the boy becoming a man, stood in the quiet of the afternoon and drank their coffee, and the conversation moved the way conversations in places like this always move when the rush is over and the work is done, and there's a moment to just be people together slowly, without agenda, touching things and leaving them the weather. Ray's sister who just had a baby, the potholes on Route 9 that the county kept promising to fix. At some point during that conversation, Jackson said something, a small thing, an observation about a regular customer's preference. The way Dale always wanted a fresh pot and never said please, but always said thank you after. And he said it with an ease and a familiarity that stopped Clara mid-sentence. And she looked at him, and Logan looked at him, and neither of them said anything about it because what they were seeing didn't need to be commented on. It was simply visible. The boy was comfortable here. Not comfortable the way he'd been comfortable walking in that first Tuesday with his expensive shoes, and his contempt comfortable because he owned the place. Comfortable the way you get comfortable in a place where you belong, where you've earned the right to be. That night, Jackson called Derek. They hadn't spoken since the morning it happened. Derek had texted twice, both times short and awkward, and Jackson hadn't answered not because he was angry, but because he hadn't had the words. Now sitting in his motel room with his feet aching pleasantly and his work clothes in a pile on the floor, he had some words. Derek answered on the second ring. Hey, he said, cautious. Hey, Jackson said, a pause. How are you? Derek asked. Good, Jackson said. Actually good. Not good like I'm covering something. Good like... He stopped. I work in a diner. Another pause. I heard, Derek said. Marcus told me. Are you okay with that? I like it, Jackson said, and he could hear how strange it sounded, how unlike the person Derek knew, and he didn't try to make it sound less strange. I like the people. I like the work. I like that every day I do something it matters to people while I'm doing it, right then. That woman with her food and her coffee and her tired morning, I helped with that. Small but real. Derek was quiet for a long time. Then he said, his voice rougher than usual. I should have said something. That morning, I should have said something way before it got to where it got. Yeah, Jackson said. You should have. I know. But I was going to say I should have been different, but that's the thing, Derek. I didn't know how to be different. I genuinely did not know. He stretched out on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the same ceiling he'd been staring at 5 weeks ago in a different way. I know more now. Not enough, but more. Can I ask you something? Derek said. Yeah. The bikers, Derek said. The Hells Angels guy, Logan. Marcus he looked him up, we both did. He's done a lot of things. Real things for real people. All those miles, all those fundraisers. He didn't have to stop that morning. He could have just sat there and finished his breakfast and rode out. He could have, Jackson agreed. Why did he? Jackson thought about it. He thought about the way Logan had stood up the 14 chairs all at once, the sound of it. He thought about what Logan had said at the counter. A person's true character is revealed by how they treat people who can't fight back. He thought about the glass of water and the napkin on the floor and his father's voice on the phone and Clara's hands pressing down on the counter and Tommy, 7 years old, who he hadn't met yet, but who existed at the center of every day in this diner, the way gravity exists at the center of every physical thing. Because that's who he is, Jackson said. That's the whole answer. It's just who he is. The 6th week Tommy came in. Clara brought him after school on a Friday because her usual arrangement had fallen through and there was no one else. And she sat him at the end of the counter with a glass of milk and a paper placemat and a set of crayons the diner kept for kids. And she said, "You sit right there and you draw, and I'll be right here the whole time. Do not bother anybody." Tommy was 7, and he had Marie's eyes, the dark, careful eyes Clara had been looking at her whole adult life. And he sat at the counter with the seriousness of a child who has been through enough to understand that the world has rules and that the adults around him are trying hard, and that his job for now is to be easy. He drew a horse. He was good at horses. Jackson saw him from across the floor and stopped. He'd known Tommy existed. Clara mentioned him the way you mention the most important thing in your life, which is obliquely, rarely, and with a particular weight behind the words. He knew the name, knew the age, knew about Marie. But the boy in front of him, drawing a horse on a placemat with a green crayon, was real in a way that the facts had not prepared him for. He walked over. He stopped at the counter across from Tommy. "Good horse," he said. Tommy looked up. "It's a Mustang," he said. "They're different from regular horses." "What's different about them?" Tommy looked at him with the evaluating look of a 7-year-old deciding whether an adult is worth educating. "They're wilder," Tommy said. "They don't belong to anybody. They just go where they want." Jackson looked at the horse on the placemat. "Is that better, not belonging to anybody?" Tommy thought about it. "Grandma says it depends on where you want to go," he said. He went back to his drawing. Jackson stood there for a moment. Clara was at a table across the room, and she had seen the exchange, and she was watching, without looking like she was watching, the particular skill of mothers and grandmothers and women who have learned that some moments require witnessing from a distance. "Do you want some milk?" Jackson asked Tommy. "Already have some," Tommy said without looking up. "Right," Jackson said. "Okay, good." He stood there one more second, feeling like a very large person in a very small moment, and then he went back to the floor. At the end of the shift, when Clara was getting Tommy's things together and the diner was closing down around them, Tommy looked up from his last drawing. He had done 3 horses, now each one more detailed, and said to Jackson, who was stacking chairs nearby, "Do you work here?" "I do," Jackson said. "Do you like it?" Jackson set a chair down and looked at the boy. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Tommy considered this. "Grandma likes it too," he said. "She says it's hard, but she likes it." He picked up his drawings carefully, the way children carry things they've made. "She says the people make it worth it." He said it the way children say things their grandmothers have said to them enough times that it has become part of their own vocabulary, absorbed and respoken without knowing it came from somewhere else. And it landed on Jackson with the particular force of a thing that arrives from an unexpected direction, from a 7-year-old with a Mustang on a placemat quoting his grandmother, quoting something she'd spent 22 years learning. The people make it worth it. He was still holding a chair. He set it down the rest of the way very carefully. "Yeah," he said to Tommy, who was already gathering his backpack and not listening anymore. "I think she's right." Clara behind them pulled on her coat. She caught Jackson's eye over the boy's head, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, which had more road to travel yet, but something that was beginning to look like it from a certain angle. An understanding. The kind that doesn't get spoken because there are no words for it yet, only the accumulating weight of weeks and coffee and aching feet and a 7-year-old's Mustangs and a napkin that had been on the floor for too long before anyone picked it up. She held the door for Tommy. She looked back at Jackson once, just once, and nodded. He nodded back. He went and got the broom. Part 5, the man he became. The broom became a ritual. Every closing shift after the last customer left and the chairs went up and Ray shut down the kitchen and the lights over the booths dimmed, one by one Jackson swept. Not because Clara asked him to anymore. She'd stopped assigning it after the 3rd week, the way you stop reminding someone to do a thing they've started doing on their own. He swept because the rhythm of it had become his, the back and forth of it, the way it moved him through every corner of the diner, past every table and booth, past the spot where his eggs had ended up on the floor, past the counter where Clara had stood with the rag and the dignity and the 2 tears she wouldn't let fall. He swept it all, every night, and every night it meant something slightly different than it had the night before. 3 months had passed since the Tuesday that had split his life into before and after. He was not the same person. He knew this the way you know things that happen to you gradually, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of small recognitions, the way you notice one morning that you've stopped doing something you used to do every day without realizing you'd stopped. He'd stopped reaching for his phone when a conversation got uncomfortable. He'd stopped calculating in the first seconds of meeting someone what they could do for him. He'd stopped entirely the habit of walking into a room and finding the person with the lowest status and deciding what he thought of them. He hadn't replaced those things with better-sounding versions of themselves. He'd just stopped needing them. Something in the structure of his days had filled in the space those habits used to occupy. The full coffee cup on a saucer, the order called correctly the first time. The woman with the baby, the man who needed his eggs exactly right, the kid who came in after school and always ordered the same thing and lit up when Jackson remembered without asking. The small, relentless, cumulative evidence that other people were real. That was the thing he would have laughed at before, the idea that you could learn something that obvious. That a 20-year-old boy could go 12 weeks serving coffee to strangers and come out the other side understanding that other people were real. It sounded like the punchline to a joke about rich kids. But it was the truest thing that had ever happened to him, and the truth of it was embarrassing in its simplicity, and he'd stopped being embarrassed by it around the 7th week. Other people were real. Their exhaustion was real. Their hunger was real. Their relief when someone treated them like they mattered was real. And the choice to be the person who created that relief rather than the one who created the opposite that choice was available every day in every interaction, in every cup of coffee, set down on every table, and it cost nothing except the willingness to make it. He was thinking about this sweeping the far corner of the diner when Clara came out of the back with her coat on and her keys in her hand and said, "Logan called today?" Jackson stopped sweeping. "When, this afternoon while you were on the lunch rush," she leaned against the counter. "He's coming through next week, wants to stop in." The whole crew, just him and a few of the others. He said. She paused, and something in her pause made Jackson look up from the broom. "He said he wants to see for himself." "See what?" Clara looked at him in the particular way she'd developed over 3 months, the look that had started as assessment and had become something warmer without ever losing its honesty. "You," she said. "He wants to see what became of you." Jackson went back to sweeping. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "And what do you think he'll see?" "I think he'll see what I see," Clara said, "which is someone I wouldn't have predicted on that first Tuesday, not in my wildest guess." "That's not a compliment exactly." "It's an honest thing," she said. "I prefer those." "I know you do." She picked up her bag. "Lock up when you're done. Ray already left." She moved toward the door, then stopped. She turned back. "Jackson." "Yeah." She looked at him steadily, the way she'd looked at him from the first moment seeing him whole and clear. "My daughter Marie," she said. "She had a quality about her. She could walk into any room, any situation, and find the person who was struggling and just be with them. Not fix it, just be with them." She paused. "Tommy has it too. You can see it already. The way he noticed the man at the counter last week, the one who'd been sitting alone for an hour. 7 years old and Tommy went and drew him a horse." Jackson was still. "I'm not saying you have what Marie had," Clara said. "That was hers. But I'm saying," she stopped. She tried again. "I'm saying that what I see in you now has a name, and the name is decency, and you didn't have it 3 months ago, and you have it now, and that is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all." She walked out. The bell jangled above the door, quieter at this hour, and then the diner was silent except for the sound of the broom moving across the floor. Jackson swept. He finished the far corner. He moved through the middle of the room past the big booth where 4 boys had sat on a Tuesday that felt now like it had happened to someone he used to know. He swept the last corner. He set the broom against the wall. He turned off the last light. He stood in the dark of the diner for a moment, just standing in the place where everything had changed. Then he locked up and went to his truck and drove to his motel room, and that night, for the first time in 3 months, he slept straight through until morning. Logan came on a Wednesday. He came with Boone and Benny and a quiet woman named Adele that Jackson hadn't seen before, who turned out to be Logan's sister and who had Logan mentioned offhandedly driven 300 miles that morning just to have Clara's coffee. Whether that was true or a courtesy, nobody asked, and Adele drank her coffee with the expression of someone who had made no mistake coming this far for it. They took the corner table. Of course they took the corner table. Jackson thought about that the way the corner table had become in his mind, a permanent fixture of the morning that started everything, a place that existed in the story of his life in a way that tables don't usually exist in lives. He brought them coffee without being asked, set the cups down one by one the right way, and then stood back. Logan looked up at him. Jackson had been trying to decide for a week what this moment would feel like. He thought it might feel like a test, like being assessed by someone with the authority to declare the experiment a success or a failure. He thought it might feel uncomfortable being seen by the man who'd witnessed him at his worst and was now looking at whatever he'd become since. It didn't feel like either of those things. It felt like being recognized. The way you feel when someone who knew you in a past version of yourself sees the current one and just looks without judgment, taking the whole picture in. "You swept already," Logan said. Jackson blinked. "How do you know?" "Floor's clean," Logan said, "but you're still holding the rhythm of it in your hands." He nodded at Jackson's hands, which were loose at his sides in the particular resting position of someone who has spent months doing the same physical work. A man carries what he does with him. You don't see it in his face usually. You see it in how he stands. Jackson looked at his own hands. "I sweep every night," he said. "I know," Logan said. "Clara told me." They looked at each other for a moment, and the look held everything. The months had held, the Tuesday morning, the chairs scraping back the 14 men standing the napkin on the floor, the glass of water, the long road from that to this, and neither of them needed to name any of it because it was all present in the room between them without names. "Sit down," Logan said. Jackson pulled out a chair and sat. Boone across the table was watching him with the same flat, evaluating expression he'd worn that first morning, and after a long moment, Boone said, "You look different." "I am different," Jackson said. "You look like you work for a living," Boone said, and the way he said it made clear this was the highest form of compliment available to him. Jackson almost smiled. "I do work for a living." "The Porsche in a garage somewhere," Benny said from the end of the table. "Storage unit in Sacramento," Jackson said. "I drive a Chevy." Benny nodded slowly. "My first car was a Chevy," he said, and then went back to his coffee. Adele had been watching Jackson quietly since he sat down in the particular way of people who notice things. Now she said, "Logan told me what happened here." "The short version or the long one?" Jackson asked. "The true one," she said. He looked at her. "Then you know it." "I know his version," she said. "What's yours?" Jackson sat with the question. He'd been asked variations of it over the past months. His father had asked, Derek had asked, a cousin in a late-night phone call had asked, and each time he'd answered it slightly differently, as if the story was still resolving, still settling into its final shape. He'd noticed that. The way a thing you did and then had to reckon with keeps rewriting itself as you get further from it, not in its facts, but in its meaning. "I walked into a room," he said, "and I looked at a woman who had done nothing to me, and I decided she wasn't a person. I decided that the entire time all morning. I kept deciding it, and she kept showing me I was wrong, and instead of that waking me up, it made me angrier. Because on some level, I needed her to not be a person. Because if she was a person, then what I was doing was wrong, and if it was wrong, then everything I'd been doing my whole life to everybody who couldn't fight back was wrong, and I couldn't hold that and still be who I was." He paused. "So I chose to not see her, until I couldn't choose it anymore." He looked at his hands. "That's the true version." Adele was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And now I see people," Jackson said. Love them, all the time. It's actually kind of overwhelming." He said it with a small, tired honesty that made Boone across the table make a short sound of genuine recognition. "Doesn't get easier," Boone said. "Seeing people, you just get stronger." "Is that better or worse?" Jackson asked. Boone thought about it. "Both," he said. "Same as most true things." Clara came to the table with the coffee pot and poured refills without being asked. And when she reached Logan, she paused, and Logan put his hand briefly over his cup, not yet still good, and looked up at her. "He's good, Clara," Logan said. "Simply, the way you report on something you have examined." "I know," Clara said. "You did that." "He did that," she said. She looked at Jackson. "I just kept the door open." She went back to the counter. Logan watched her go. Then he said to no one in particular, to the table in the morning and the room, "She's something, that woman." "She's the best person I know," Jackson said, and said it without hesitation, which was itself a thing that would not have been possible 3 months ago, the immediacy of it, the absence of irony. The table went quiet for a moment. Then Logan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out and set it on the table between them. It was small and flat and looked like a coin, and it was a coin, a challenge coin, the kind motorcycle clubs give heavy, and engraved the Hells Angels death's head on one side and on the other a single line. Jackson had to pick it up and tilt toward the light to read. He read it, he put it down, he looked at Logan. "What does this mean?" he said. "It means what it says," Logan said. The coin said. He stood up. Jackson looked at it. He looked at Logan. "I didn't stand up," he said. "You stood up. You and everyone at this table. I was the one who—" "You came back," Logan said. "You came back when you didn't have to. You sat down when nobody had made you. You stayed when it was hard. You picked up a broom." He held Jackson's gaze. "In my experience, the hardest standing up a man ever does is not the moment he rises from his chair. It's every morning after that when he decides to keep going, when nobody's watching, when the room's empty, when the only thing that knows whether you did the right thing is you." He nodded at the coin. "Keep it." Jackson looked at the coin for a long moment. He closed his hand around it. "Thank you," he said, not performed, not polished, just 2 words given honestly to a man who had stood up on a Tuesday morning and changed the direction of a life. Logan picked up his coffee. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You've got a long road." "I know." "You'll mess up again," Logan said. "Not like that morning, but you'll mess up, differently, in new ways you haven't invented yet." That's encouraging, Jackson said. "It's true," Logan said, "which is better than encouraging." He drank his coffee. "What matters is whether you know how to find your way back." "I think I'm starting to," Jackson said. "That's enough for now," Logan said. "That's plenty." The twist came 4 days later, and it came from a direction that nobody in the Silver Spoon had seen approaching. Sandra Chu published the story. Not the story about Jackson, not the piece she'd been building from the Billings incident, in the Napa incident, in the Tuesday morning at the diner. She published a different story entirely, a longer one, a broader one, the kind of story that takes months to report because it's not about one morning or one boy, but about a pattern, about the way money operates in small communities, about the hotel workers and restaurant staff and service employees whose complaints had been managed and settled and buried by a succession of legal teams and hush money for 20 years of Whitmore family business. It was not a story about Jackson specifically. His name appeared, but not prominently. The piece was about systems, about the infrastructure of silence that money builds around the people it damages. Richard Whitmore read it on a Thursday morning in his Sacramento office and called his lawyer, and then 20 minutes later, called his son. Jackson picked up on the first ring. "You've seen it," Richard said. "Just now," Jackson said. He was in the diner parking lot on his break, the cold Montana air coming through the truck window that he'd cracked. "She ran it." "She ran it," Richard confirmed. His voice was measured the way it always was when he was deciding something in real time. "My lawyer wants to respond. Issue a statement, challenge the sourcing, the usual." "Is the sourcing wrong?" Jackson asked. A pause. "No," Richard said. "Then don't challenge it," Jackson said. Another pause longer. "That's not how this works, Jackson. There are, Dad." His voice was quiet, but it didn't move. "The people in that story were real. What happened to them was real. Your lawyers already paid them once to stay quiet, and that didn't fix anything. It just moved the problem into a drawer." Sandra Chu opened the drawer. He paused. "Let her." Richard was silent for a long time. On the line between them, Jackson could hear the particular silence of a man revising something fundamental, the way a building shifts when a load-bearing wall is removed and everything has to redistribute its weight. "You understand what that means for the business," Richard said. "I understand what it means for the people," Jackson said. The silence stretched another beat. "Yeah," Richard said finally, and the word was small and heavy. "Yeah, okay." He didn't call the lawyer back. The statement Richard Whitmore released instead, 3 paragraphs. No legal language, no hedging. His name on it in plain letters, acknowledged the incidents, acknowledged the failures of his oversight, announced the establishment of a fund for affected employees that was 3 times the size of the original settlements, and included at the end a sentence that his PR team had argued against and that Richard had kept in anyway. The sentence read, "This should have been handled differently, and it wasn't, and the responsibility for that begins with me." Sandra Chu ran the statement alongside the original piece. She added one paragraph of her own. It noted that the change in approach from the Whitmore family had come by all accounts from a conversation in a diner in Montana with a woman named Clara Hayes, and a chance encounter with a group of men who had decided on a Tuesday morning that silence was not an option. Clara read the article on her phone during the slow hour before lunch. She read it twice. She set the phone down on the counter and looked at the wall for a moment, and Ray watched her from the kitchen and didn't say anything, and Earl at his stool said very gently, "You all right, Clara?" "I'm all right, Earl," she said. And then, because it was true, "I'm better than all right." Jackson read it in the parking lot of the diner and sat in the truck for a long time afterward, not processing it exactly, more like feeling the weight of it. The way a thing that started with a spilled cup of coffee and a napkin thrown at a woman's face had traveled in 3 months to a published piece of journalism, in a fund for workers, in a statement with his father's name on it. The way that single terrible morning had cracked something open that had needed to be open for years. The way Clara's 4 quiet words, "everyone deserves respect," had turned out to be in practice a stone thrown into still water, the rings of it spreading further than anyone could have calculated when she said them. He thought about that. He thought about how the smallest acts of dignity are actually the largest ones. How refusing to let someone make you small is one of the most powerful things a human being can do. How Clara Hayes had done it every day for 22 years in a diner in a nowhere town for customers who ranged from generous to cruel, and the accumulated weight of that daily practice had been there in the room, real and structural, waiting to matter the way good things wait quietly and without announcement until the moment arrives. He got out of the truck, he went back inside, he picked up his order pad. The story, of course, did not end with the article. Stories like this never end with the dramatic moment. They end with the ordinary ones that come after the daily choosing, the quiet accumulation of who you decide to be when nobody's watching. But there were things that happened in the weeks and months that followed that needed saying because they were true and because truth earns its telling. Derek came to Montana. He drove up from wherever he'd been, which turned out to be nursing school. He'd enrolled quietly 2 months after that morning, without telling anyone, without making an announcement. Just done it, and he came in on a Sunday afternoon and sat at the counter and ordered coffee. And when Jackson brought it, Derek looked at him for a long moment and said, "You look like someone I used to know, but better." "You look like someone who decided something," Jackson said. "Nursing school," Derek said. "I know," Jackson said. "Marcus told me." "Marcus told you." "Marcus calls me every couple weeks," Jackson said. "He's been calling since the 2nd month." Derek stared at him. "He never told me that." "He's private about some things," Jackson said. He poured Derek's coffee and then leaned on the counter across from him. "How's school?" "Hard," Derek said. "Really hard. The hours are insane, and I'm the oldest in most of my classes, and I have no idea what I'm doing half the time." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "I love it." Jackson nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I know that feeling." They talked for 2 hours. Not about that Tuesday, not directly. They talked about the kind of things you talk about when you've been friends your whole life, and you've both recently discovered that the people you were don't fit you anymore. The slightly giddy, slightly terrifying feeling of being new to yourself. When Derek left, he shook Jackson's hand and held it a second and said, "I'm sorry I didn't say anything earlier, that morning, and all the mornings before it." "I wouldn't have heard you," Jackson said. "I wasn't ready to hear it. I should have said it anyway." "Maybe," Jackson said, "but you're saying it now." Derek nodded. He left a 20 on the counter for a $2 coffee, and when Jackson called after him about it, Derek was already out the door, and the bell was still jangling when Clara appeared at Jackson's shoulder and said, "Good friend." "Getting better at it," Jackson said. "All of you are," she said, "late bloomers." She said it without cruelty. Just the plain fact of it, the way she said everything. And then she handed him an order and sent him back to the floor. The moment that the story of stories have to end somewhere truly ended came on a Saturday morning in the 4th month. It came quietly, the way all true endings come, not announced, not scored, with dramatic music, just arriving like any other Saturday in a diner that had been feeding people for 47 years without requiring anything dramatic of its mornings. Jackson was behind the counter. Clara was on the floor. Tommy was at his usual end-of-counter spot with a placemat and crayons because Clara had worked a double and there was no other place for him to be, and the Silver Spoon by this point had become the place where Tommy spent his after-school hours and his weekend mornings, and where every regular knew his name and his horse drawings and his preference for chocolate milk over white. Tommy was drawing. He was drawing something new, not a horse for the first time in weeks. He was drawing a diner. You could tell because he'd drawn a counter and some stools and a sign that said Silver Spawn in careful 7-year-old letters and small figures at the tables with big heads and stick arms. Jackson looked at the drawing while he poured coffee. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing at a figure behind the counter. "Grandma," Tommy said. "And that one." Tommy looked at the figure Jackson was pointing to, a tall stick figure with what appeared to be a broom. "That's you," Tommy said matter-of-factly, and went back to coloring. Jackson stood very still for a second. He was in the drawing. He was in the drawing as a matter of fact, as a natural occupant of the world. Tommy was putting on paper, not a special edition or a visitor, but a figure who belonged in the diner the same way the counter belonged, and the stools belonged, and the sign belonged. Tommy had drawn him the way you draw things that simply are without question or explanation, things that are just there. He set the coffee pot down very carefully. He pressed his hands flat on the counter. He breathed. Clara came through from the floor and stopped beside him and looked at the drawing and then looked at him. She saw his face. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said very quietly, just to him, "You're part of this place now." "I didn't." He stopped, started again. "I almost destroyed it. I almost destroyed you. That morning, I know what you did," she said. "I was there." Her voice was steady and clear. No anger in it, but no absolution either, just the plain acknowledgement of fact. "And I know what you've done since. Both of those things are true. They'll always both be true." She looked at him. "But a person is not only their worst morning. You know that now." "I know that now," he said. "So do I," she said. "About you." She went back to the floor. She had tables to turn and customers to see to, and a Saturday to get through, and the diner did not pause for emotional moments any more than any other place of work does, which is to say it continued being itself regardless of what was happening in the hearts of the people inside it. Jackson picked up the coffee pot. He went back to work. Logan called that afternoon while Jackson was on his break, the same parking lot, the same truck, the Montana sky, doing the enormous thing it always did. "I read the piece again," Logan said. "Sandra's piece." "Which part?" Jackson asked. "The last part," Logan said. "The part about Clara, about the conversation that started it." "What about it?" Logan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality it got when he was saying something he'd been sitting with for a while, not a spontaneous thought, but something examined and decided. "I've been on the road a long time," he said. "I've been in a lot of rooms, seen a lot of situations go in a lot of directions. I've watched men decide who to be and men decide who not to be. And I want to tell you something." "Okay," Jackson said. "What you did coming back, staying doing the work, that's not nothing. I don't want you to carry it like it's nothing. You hear people say change is hard, and it sounds like a slogan, like something you put on a coffee mug. But I've watched it be hard. I've watched people try and not make it. And I watched you make it." His voice was level and clear. "You should know that." Jackson sat in the truck in the cold parking lot and held the phone and let that land. "I had help," he said. "Everyone who makes it has help," Logan said. "That's not the point. Plenty of people have help and still don't make it. You made choices. Give yourself that." Jackson nodded even though Logan couldn't see him. "How's the road?" he said after a moment. "Long," Logan said. "Always long." A pause. "How's the diner?" "The same," Jackson said. "Exactly the same." He thought about Tommy's drawing, the counter and the stools and the Silver Spawn sign and the stick figure with the broom. "And I'm part of it now," he said. "Somehow." "That's how it works," Logan said. "You go somewhere long enough and you do the work and you care about the people, you become part of it. That's not magic. That's just what caring does." They talked for a few more minutes, easy and without agenda, two people who had found each other on an unlikely morning and come out the other side of it with something that didn't have a simple name. Then Logan said he needed to get back on the road, and Jackson said, okay, and Logan said, take care of Clara, and Jackson said, I will. And that was how they said goodbye, and it was enough. Jackson sat in the truck for one more minute after the call ended. He looked at the diner through the windshield. He looked at the cracked neon sign and the gravel lot and the ordinary face of a place that had been feeding people for 47 years and would go on feeding them long after everyone who'd been inside it on that particular Tuesday was gone. He thought about what Clara had said. You're part of this place now. He thought about Logan's coin still in his jacket pocket, the weight of it familiar now. He stood up engraved on one side. He thought about the napkin on the floor. He thought about the glass of water. He thought about Tommy's Mustangs, the ones that didn't belong to anybody that just went where they wanted. He thought about what Clara had said that depends on where you want to go. He knew now where he wanted to go. Not California, not back to the car and the card and the life his father's money had built around him, like a house with no windows. He wanted to go where he could be useful, where what he did in a day mattered to someone while he was doing it, where the work was real and the people were real and the connection between them was real and couldn't be bought or erased or managed into silence. He didn't know exactly what that looked like yet in practical terms. He was 20 years old. He had time to find out. But he knew what it felt like. He'd been feeling it every morning for 4 months. He felt it in the sweep of the broom, in the set of the coffee cup, and the woman with the baby, and the little boy drawing horses, and the old man at the counter, and the cook who said exactly as much as something was worth. He felt it in the weight of a challenge coin, and the memory of 14 chairs scraping back, and a woman who had stood her ground with nothing behind her but her own dignity and a dead daughter, and a grandson who needed shoes and 22 years of practice being kind. That was what strength looked like. He knew that now. Not the kind he'd been performing his whole life, the loud, expensive kind that required an audience and a bank account and someone weaker to stand on. The other kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need a room to witness it because it comes from inside and goes out into the world and does its work without ceremony. He got out of the truck. He walked back into the diner. Clara looked up from the counter. Break's over, she said. I know, he said. He picked up his order pad. He went to his first table. He never really left. Some people find out who they are in a single defining moment, a speech, a battle, a choice that gets remembered. Jackson Whitmore found out who he was in the opposite way slowly, Gordon, over hundreds of small moments in a diner no one had heard of for people whose names he would carry with him the rest of his life. He found it in the broom and the coffee pot and the aching feet and the napkin, always the napkin, and in a 58-year-old grandmother who had refused against every reason and every pressure and every advantage stacked against her to be small. She had said 4 words, everyone deserves respect. They had turned out to be the 4 most important words of his life. And the boy who had once walked into a room to look down on the people in it became a man who walked into rooms looking for ways to be of use, and he never, not once in all the years that followed, forgot what had made him.